Good evening, everyone. I'm going to call the January 21st, 2020 meeting of the Town Council to order. May we have a roll call, please?
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Syak. Councilmember Rennie.
Here.
Vice Mayor Spector.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Jensen.
Here. And this is a time in our meeting where we are pleased to invite up a person to lead our pledge. Mr. Robert Stanley, would you join me, please? Robert is a junior in 11th grade at Los Gatos High School, and he's also a member of our Youth Commission. Thank you, Robert. I asked him, why are you on the Youth Commission? What inspired you? 4 years ago when his family came to town, they actually attended a planning commission meeting. I said, why? Just because they were interested, and he continued to be interested and was encouraged to watch government and get involved. So here he is today. But he also enjoys writing, writes short stories, and photography. And I also saw that you're a teaching assistant at Fitcher. Congratulations. And so, Robert, will you lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Robert. Can we get a hand for Robert? Okay, one more round of applause for Robert, please. Robert, thank you for coming. All right, now I don't normally do presentations, but tonight I'm going to. This is a presentation that I'm very happy to give tonight, which is something that I had advocated and wanted to do as part of my term as mayor, which is to recognize those people or organizations in the community that as a result of something that they believe in, something that they want to do, or just as a matter of public service, have gone above and beyond to provide service to our town as a whole. And I'm pleased to invite Rob Stump up to get our first award. Mr. Stump. Those of you who pay attention to our meetings, Mr. Stump has been quite an advocate on fire safety, and single-handedly, over the 2 years in the Foster Road area, has organized over 43 neighbors to come together as a coalition. I don't know what you call team, neighborhood, organized and practiced evacuation routes, come up with a communication network, gotten training from County Fire, and has come to our town council meetings to advocate for fire safety for Los Gatos. Mr. Trump has done this all on his own time, and his own energy, and that's the thing that I want to honor with our very first Community Champion little proclamation award for Mr. Stump. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And if you want to say something.
I just want to say that I've had a tremendous experience working with the town staff, particularly Arn Andrews, Matt Morley, and others that have been really supportive as we really discuss, excuse me, a very important issue related to public safety, and probably the single most important thing and most challenging for our community, which would be wildfire. So again, thanks to those folks as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stump, and thank you for your service to our town. And speaking of service to our town, it's now my chance to honor outgoing members of our boards and commissions. As some of you know, we have several advisory boards and commissions that help the council with work over the course of a year or years, and I'm really pleased to be able to give certificates tonight to persons who have served the community well, who are now standing aside to go on to bigger and better things. So first I'm going to recognize the Bicycle and Pedestrian Commission. Those of you that are leaving the Bicycle and Pedestrian, come on up. So I've got, come on up. Yes, please. Jeff Lockridge, thank you, Jeff. Sheldon Gilbert, thank you, Sheldon. Heidi Owens. Thank you, Heidi. And can I have just a round of applause for these people who are also serving our community? Thank you very much for everything you've done. And if you have a spokesperson and you want to say something, you get a chance.
Well, I'd probably like to say that I'm proud of everybody that came together and got the BPAC where it is today, and that includes the town council staff, the staff, and all the residents who came together that were there throughout the years. And I know it's changing to a different name, but I think it's still moving on and doing better things every year. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, Heidi, and Sheldon for everything you've done to forward that effort as well. And next is our Community and Senior Services. And I have Maureen and Jennifer. Please come forward. Our Community and Senior Services Commission does a lot for our senior community, and they are very energetic and have a lot of things on their plate and have accomplished a lot. So let me give you your certificates. And can I get a round of applause?
It was a real pleasure to work with the town once they received the designation of age-friendly through the World Health Organization, and to work with Arn. He is really an amazing guy. Thank you.
It's your big chance. Okay, thank you very much. I have one last for Amy Leonard. We weren't sure if she could come tonight. She's not here, but there were a lot of people who serve the town in lots of different ways on our commissions and who continue to serve the town. For those of you that did not make it tonight, and I'm going to give a special shout out to Tom O'Donnell, who I had the privilege of working with and has served on the Planning Commission for millions of years, but done a great job. And so a special thanks to him and those that could not attend tonight. But those that did, thank you, and you have our gratitude. Thanks very much. Which brings us to our consent calendar. It consists of 8 items tonight. Consent calendar is normally those things that staff or the town has determined are generally not controversial and amenable to being passed in a single motion. That said, if anyone, despite that, wants to pull an item, you can do so. Anyone on the council want to pull an item from consent? Anyone in the public wants to pull an item from consent? Seeing no one. Motion?
I'll move to approve items 1 through 8 that's on our consent calendar.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Aye. And I've been handed a note that says I skipped over part of the agenda, sorry. First, our closed session report, Mr. Schultz.
Yes, good evening, Mayor and Council. Prior to tonight's regular session, Council met in closed session to discuss real property negotiations. The property was the New Moo lease and conditions in terms of that lease right here at Civic Center. No action was taken that requires reporting under the Brown Act.
Thank you. Council members, is a portion of our agenda where even though as members of the council, we regularly meet with people in the community or persons who request to meet with us and participate in ceremonial events. We also serve on formal boards and commissions on a regional basis or with the town. And this is the time where council members can report on those items of interest to the community at large. So is there any reporting for this evening? Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll start off. On December 18th, I attended a 17 roundtable in Senator Bell's office. Caltrans was present, VTA was present, and the Highway Patrol was present, and members of our town staff were also present. The discussions were around improvements to 17 for both safety and efficiency of flow. Also, let's see, in December, on December 28th, VTA started their new system of routes and of buses and light rail. And at 4:15 in the morning, I was at the Chioba yard to see the first bus from that yard break through our banner and celebrate the new service redesign. And for Los Gatos, that means the routes have changed. We now have the 27 coming through Los Gatos instead of the 48 or 49, I guess it is. And that it's a slightly different route through Los Gatos, but it's more frequent at 15-minute intervals. In other VT items, we did have a board meeting on 1/9 where there was a call from a lot of the public for the VTA board to pass a resolution that there's a climate emergency and to reallocate money from highways towards bus routes and other transit. That's maybe an item coming to the board actually this early February. That was it for VTA. I also attended several Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority meetings. We had a board meeting, risk oversight committee meeting, finance and admin meeting I attended. Also, we had a ribbon cutting on the 20th of this month for a new place called Embodied Recoverer. And it's located at 20 South Santa Cruz, and it's a new, it's large. I think there's several therapists, and it's for people that are recovering from addictions and I guess other wellness needs. And today I also attended an interesting lunch with Spur and the Greenbelt where they were talking about how do we preserve our open spaces around the Bay Area and have more infill development. That's it for me.
Anyone else? Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I attended the West Valley Sanitation District meeting, and the most significant issue there was the confirming of the transfer of our storm drain management to the West Valley Clean Water Authority. Thank you.
Ms. Sayak?
Just wanted to remind council and staff that on January 29, League of Cities is hosting a housing forum, and at that time we should have the most up-to-date information on housing legislation that looks like it will be passing, specifically SB 50, and we'll have representatives from ABAG, MTC, and ILG there. And any news that happens between now and then, I'll be sure to pass to our town manager, and she'll be sharing with all of us as well.
Thank you. Just a short comment on the VTA Policy Advisory Committee. The VTA is rolling out an express bus pilot. We are not part of it, unfortunately, but we did get information, thank you, Mr. Morley, on the parameters of the pilot, how we might qualify, metrics going forward. So it's something that Los Gatos is keeping an eye on as a possible means of supplementing or standing in for, if you will, or I'll say supplementing at this point, the school bus pilot program. Okay, that said, it's now time, manager. I just want to skip everything, sorry.
That's all right. Thank you, Mayor. First of all, just a reminder that the Highway 17 fuel break project is going to be continuing now that the rains have subsided somewhat. So please expect delays if you are traveling that corridor Monday through Thursdays, 9 to 3. And then in addition, the town library is offering 500 programs from January through May as part of our offerings. And in particular, we're doing Facebook Live story times on Monday nights at 8 p.m. featuring bedtime stories that are appropriate for families. And we're also doing Girls Who Code, which teaches coders from ages 12 to 18 to build animations, games, and apps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pavetti. And I'm going to ask you to do another shameless plug for the community budget survey that went out, which is apropos to this evening.
Yes, so we are featuring a very, very short survey. It's 3 questions where we are asking the public to rank its preferences for future investments should the council identify an additional $1 million for investment. We're very eager to get our public's input. We did provide a baseline results that we received as of last week in one of our staff reports this evening. Please visit us at our town website, losgatosca.gov, and you'll find the survey right on the front page.
Thanks very much. Now is the time, an opportunity for those who wish to talk to the council about something that is not on tonight's agenda. So if you have an issue that you'd like to speak to us about, but it's not on our regular agenda, during verbal communications you can do that for 3 minutes. Then I have a card from Gail Bloom.
Hi, I'm Gail Bloom. I live at 122 University Avenue, but I am the program director at Live Oak Adult Services in Cupertino. But the reason I'm up here is to kind of talk a little bit about Live Oak Adult Day Services in Los Gatos. When I started with Live Oak about 7+ years ago, Los Gatos had about 18 clients a day. It was vibrant, it was exciting. And right now, we're seeing a reduction in that number. And we want to have the council and our community come to an open house that we are having in February and get the word out that this wonderful program for people who need assistance, seniors who need assistance in a structured environment, are able to have a quality program including cognitive stimulation, music and art therapy, wonderful nutrition, physical and just the cognitive part of it. I just want to go back to because it's so important when people have dementia, Alzheimer's, other kind of memory loss, that they have the stimulation that they need every day to give them a quality of life. And that's what we offer at Live Oak. And being a Live Oak resident, I don't want this service to leave our area, Again, when I was here 7 years ago, people were coming down from Summit. They're coming down from the mountain requiring our assistance. It's such a valuable and vital program, I think, to our community that I just really want to get the word out. We need to up the numbers. Okay, we just can't keep going on with the numbers we're at right now. So, saying that, again, I'm going to introduce our executive director and the program director here at Cupertino, at Los Gatos, but I just want my community to understand the importance of this program and come out and come to our open house in February and promote this throughout our area to let people know that there's a place that the caregivers can get a respite and their loved ones can get this quality care every day.
You have 2 questions, Ms. Spector.
Thank you. Can you give us the date, time, and location in February?
I have invitations for each of you.
But I'm suggesting
February 13th from 4 to 6? 4:30 to 6, sorry. And it's just, we're going to show what the program's about. We're going to give you an opportunity to see the different enrichment programs we have for our clients. And we really would appreciate you coming. This is Lisa.
Okay, hang on, Lisa. You're going to start with a new 3 minutes, but you don't have to take all of it if what you want to say has been said. But Ms. Sayak, did your question get answered? Okay.
Let me first introduce myself. My name's Lisa Lenoci, and I'm the current program director for the Los Gatos Live Oak. Fairly new to the position. I've been on board for about 6 months now. And as Gail already mentioned, before I started, our numbers had dipped. So it's my job, or part of my job at least, to try to see if we can turn that around. The Live Oak Adult Day Service has 4 locations throughout Santa Clara County. The others are in Willow Glen, San Jose, Cupertino, and Gilroy. and they're all flourishing. So, but it all started here in Los Gatos back in 1983, and we'd like to make sure that we get that back on track. We believe it has become a very integral part of the Los Gatos community. We do serve the community members and want to make sure that they're aware that we have the service available. Our open house will be at our center. We lease space from the Los Gatos United Methodist Church right across the street on 111 Church Street. So you'll get to actually see what the facility looks like and get a little sampling of the program. Our executive director is also here with us tonight, if we can introduce her.
Introduce
I'm Ann
yourself.
Peterson. I took over as executive director in May and trying to sort of pick up pieces and put things back together again. And I think we have a really great program. It had slowly gone down. Now we have a much more vibrant staff. We're trying to focus more on the quality of the program. Our program gets a little bit mixed up with the food program, the nutrition program, which is just down the hallway from us, which is a daily program for seniors. Our program is it's a daily lunch program for seniors. Our program runs from 9 to 3 and provides all the other extra structure for folks who can't negotiate that lunch program. So it adds a lot of extras for very dependent, frail folks. We just hope that we can get the numbers up and keep it in the community. It's really, really important to keep it in the community. I love the fact that we have 4 different centers and 4 with very different personalities. It's really a great thing. Thank you.
You have a question for Mr. Rennie.
So my question would be, it seems like, the question is, have you thought to try to connect with the 55-plus program that we have at the Adult Rec Center? It seems to me that they may graduate from that program at some point in their life and want to come over, or they have people they know that maybe have graduated to the point they can't make it to the Adult Rec Center anymore. So that might be a good place to inform
yes,
people.
and most certainly they're on our list to send an invitation to the open house. I have joined the Chamber of Commerce, which has a special group for the nonprofit Los Gatos service providers, and so I'm getting to gradually know some of the other groups, including that 55 plus.
And we also have an infographic that the town puts out that Mr. Andrews is involved with. I'm sure he must have that on our infographic. Yeah. Yeah.
Very good.
Okay, thank you.
And since we
Thank
are
you
here,
very
I
much.
also wanted to just very briefly, we get funding, a grant from the town. I want to just thank you for that. We appreciate that.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't have any other cards for verbal communications. Okay, so we're going to move on to the main portion of our agenda, the public hearings, and just a little information for those of you interested in the items that are on the public hearings. The way we run them is that a staff member will give us a summary of the staff report that the council members all have. We are going to have an opportunity then to ask that staff member questions. Following that, we invite members of the public to come up and talk to us. You have 3 minutes to speak. We ask you to talk to us, although it's tempting to turn around and talk to your neighbors. It's nice if you talk to us. Don't run away from the podium right away after your 3 minutes, because as you see, there could be questions. We ask everyone to give polite and respectful attention to those who are speaking, and consider or not whether, if you've heard the point that you wish to be made, whether you need to make it as well. That said, and then following the closing of the public hearing, then the council will have additional opportunity for questions, a debate, and then ultimately a motion. So that said, we'll move to the first item in our, oh, and if you have your phone on, please silence it. Which is number 9, which is a public hearing to consider objections to the proposed abatement of hazardous vegetation. Ms. Hockmeyer.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm Stephanie Hockemeyer, Executive Assistant from the Parks and Public Works Department, providing you with our annual program to abate weeds, with the primary objective being voluntary compliance from property owners. When a property is identified as having hazardous weeds, it's placed in the program, monitored, and on the program must be there for 3 consecutive years of compliance before they're removed from this program. So the list before you are the properties that represent the abatement program currently, and they must abate weeds by the deadline that the county has given. Any abatement that is performed by the county for these property owners will be assessed to the property owners for the recovery of those costs. And that list will come to council at a later date this year. We did receive 1 written request for consideration of removal, which is attached as a desk item. At this time, I was notified by the county that the property was added to this program in June, or identified, so this is their first year in the program. The county and staff both have recommended that the property remain on the list to be consistent and fair with the program. Staff recommends that you, council, consider any objections and then move forward with ordering the abatement of the weeds. And present here with, for any needs, is Mo Cumry from the county, and that concludes my report.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
Ms. Hockemeyer, so I appreciate you mentioning the public comment we did get on 15931. So I understand it's staff's recommendation to keep them on the list, but because they did their own voluntary compliance and cleanup, so I want to confirm, 1, that no further cost will be given to them if they maintain this cleanup. And then 2, is there a way to explain to the property owner why they're going to remain on the list after they've already voluntarily cleaned up the property?
I can answer a couple of those things. I may request Mo to add some additional input, but they are responsible for an annual fee at this point of $101, which is the very beginning of the abatement cost for any property that's identified and looked at. For the second part of your question, I think I'll defer to Mo.
Yes, my name is Mo Cumry, and I am the manager of the weed abatement program for Santa Clara County. Regarding the fee that's assessed for inspection, we are a cost recovery program. We get no general fund dollars, so this is how we pay for the operation of the program. If a property owner needs information regarding being included in the program, they can contact us. We're happy to do an on-site meeting where we can explain what we saw, what they need to do, and how to ensure that their property is maintained in a fire-safe condition, and the things they can do to get their property to no longer have a threat of fire so that they could then be removed early.
So, which I appreciate. We want the whole purpose of the program is fire abatement. What I wanted to find out is if our staff could make that contact with this property owner, given the hardship, personal hardship that this family has endured, just to explain the reason why they're going to remain on the list so that there's no further trauma that we're incurring to this family.
Of course, staff will follow any recommendation that council advises.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else from council? Okay, I have no cards on this item. All right, so seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing. Look to the council for a motion on this. Councilwoman Sayak.
Okay, so I move that we consider the proposed abatement of hazardous vegetation for property listed on the 2020 report. We've noted the voluntary compliance of 15931 Blossom Hill Road, and just ask town staff to reach out to this property owner explaining the circumstances of why they're remaining on the list and what they can do to prevent further assessment.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Rennie. All in favor? Aye. Passes unanimously. Thank you, Ms. Hochmeyer. Which brings us to item 10, which is a proposal for amendments to various portions of various chapters, if you will, of the Los Gatos Town Code, fire prevention and protection, garbage, refuse and weeds, and tree protection, all of which have to do with fire safety amendments. So Mr. Schultz, I think you're going to report. Mr. Andrews, you're going to report. Okay.
Thank
You're
you.
a lawyer.
Thank you, Mayor and Town Council. So the item before you is a continuation of efforts that this council has undertaken in the past year, which is really trying to find opportunities to help mitigate wildfire in our wildland-urban interface area. Back in April, this council adopted Annex 9 of the Santa Clara County Community Wildfire Protection Plan. Then earlier this year, this council also received a wildfire evacuation assessment. And during that assessment, staff identified several areas of our ordinances that were not necessarily in alignment with what is the state mandated law for 100 feet of defensible space within the wildland-urban interface area. And so traditionally every year when we bring the recommendations forward for the building code, we usually include Chapter 49 of the building code with some amendments that are brought forward based on staff or by county fire input. This year, we asked to hold off on that. The code was adopted without those, and we're bringing those revisions to you tonight because we wanted to bring them in conjunction with some recommended revisions to Chapter 29, the tree protection ordinance. And previously, this council enhanced the definition of weeds in Chapter 11 for the program we just heard about, and based on our review, staff has one minor edit there. The primary purpose of the item before you tonight, though, is one, to make sure that the town reflects in its municipal code the fact that the 100 feet of defensible space is state law. We want to make sure that we emphasize that point and that we bring to bear the elements of other state laws that homeowners are required to do to be a proper land steward. One of the other areas we looked at was the fact that some of the language in our tree protection ordinance either might make trying to have defensible space by state law done is either onerous, sometimes it's almost an impediment, and so we wanted to try to align those. So in conjunction with the recommendations of defensible space, which also include under the state law the ability to require defensible space in extreme circumstances where the fire official or his or her designee determine it to be an imminent threat, we can go beyond the property line. The state law mandates 100 feet of defensible space to the property line, but the state law also allows local jurisdictions to go beyond that property line. You will see that carve-out done in many of the counties in the state, and we are recommending that we do that in our community because of our risk of wildfire. One of the other areas that we've added for recommendation is our fire professionals have a recommendation that in the wildland-urban interface, there should be 5 feet of a non-flammable surface around structures. That is currently a recommendation, but we feel our fire professionals are more in tune with what's required and given the fire threat, and so we're going ahead and making that recommendation also. I mentioned that the defensible space recommendations tie into Chapter 29 of tree protection. What staff is recommending is within Chapter 29, there's a section called exceptions. So we're recommending that trees that either need to be removed or maintained in the furtherance of defensible space be listed under those exceptions. However, with the exception of certain trees that are also identified in another section of Chapter 29 that refers to either heritage trees, several species of oak, madrona, and another species of tree. We would still, because of the nature of those trees and the importance that they provide, we still would like them to go through the traditional sections of Chapter 29, but any other tree that needs to be either removed or maintained for defensible space would be exempted from the provisions of Chapter 29. With that, we are available for questions. When I say we still have representatives from the county weed abatement program, and tonight we also have Chief Linney of the Santa Clara Fire Department if you have questions of any of us.
Thank you very much. Are there questions? Ms. Spector.
Thank you. With regard to defensible space, who implements it? And I'm going to put this in a scenario for you. One would assume that the homeowner or the property owner would implement it, or the homeowner. But what if he or she does not? And then who follows up to find out if it happened? And then who follows up if it wasn't done?
Thank you for the question. So there's several stakeholders in all this process. The county, through their weed abatement program, has very specific guidelines in the weed abatement program, which that program is designed to create defensible space. It creates defensible space along roadways, and it also creates, I believe, initially a 30-foot perimeter from a structure. And so they're responsible for identifying properties that are not in compliance with the weed abatement program in Chapter 11. And this council, as I said previously, made sure that our definition of weeds was much more expansive to include a whole host of flammable materials. And so they have the tools at their disposal to make sure that they can have a very aggressive weed abatement program. County Fire then has a program where you can ask for an inspection of your property to get some best practices on how they would perceive your property could have a defensible space that meets, their definition of what a good defensible space is. CAL FIRE provides guidance on defensible space, and depending on council's action tonight, staff will put together a website with all these tools and resources to help homeowners understand how to create defensible space. In addition, the language that's recommended where we start to talk about going beyond a property line, ideally, anybody that is a stakeholder in the wildland-urban interface will understand the importance of this. Staff is going to help educate folks about the importance of this, and hopefully neighbors will do as neighbors should, and they'll be able to come to terms by themselves. In the event that neighbors aren't capable of coming to some type of agreement themselves, this will then allow for an inspection to be conducted by fire or the designee represented for County Fire. And if they deem that there is a definite physical danger imposed by an adjacent property owner, then similar to the weed abatement program, they will advise that that property be abated.
Following up, well, not actually following up on that, but in the same subject area, how are we addressing, or how would you suggest we address the town's narrow road widths and dead ends?
That's a very good question. We are a historic town starting in the 1880s, and some roads that might have been deemed appropriate at that time are probably no longer appropriate for modern firefighting equipment. There are some areas in town that could use either widening. There's also some immediate fixes that the council could consider, for instance, alternative side of the street parking. If we know we have an area that could be susceptible to choke points, maybe during the wildfire season, we only allow parking on one side of the road, especially where we know these are areas where we're going to need residents to be able to flush out of in the event of an evacuation. In terms of actual construction of additional width of roads, I'm going to have to defer to our public works officials on that. That would have to be something that would be conceptualized in the CIP. It would have to be budgeted for, and so in that regard, that would be a longer-term project. I do believe, though, that some of the recommendations that were currently adopted for Chapter 11 in tandem with these, if we can at a minimum make sure that we have defensible space clearance on either side of these very important roads for evacuation, that is an extremely good first step. If we make sure that we have all the stakeholders in the WUI making sure that they're also hardening their own structures and their own homes so that in the event of wildfire, we think that they'll be safe in their homes as opposed to possibly having to vacate. All of these are good measures to try and secure the protection of our community.
Thank you.
Other questions? Ms. Sayak?
So 2 questions to follow up on that. With regard, we had asked at the last meeting during priority setting how PPW basically goes through their priority setting in terms of what trees get repaired, what streets get repaired, and then what trees get pruned. And so I'm assuming as we embark on this plan that that is a priority factor for staff as they start to look at which roadways will get maintained, which shrubberies will get cleaned up, and all that would be folded into the CIP?
Certainly safety is a primary concern. So anytime we have a safety concern, we would take that as a priority location for maintenance or capital improvements.
Okay, and then so if there's any budgetary increases, that would also come forward in the next budget cycle?
Absolutely.
And then my second question, I know in the past we had talked about putting a hold on permit parking, well, parking in general, given different neighborhood conflicts with regard to parking. And one of the things that we had always said is how do we define safety as a reason for no parking and or permit parking? Given what we have just learned, are we now relooking at this parking program and seeing if there's options to change what streets get red striped and what streets get permit parking?
So I think the short answer is yes. We haven't yet started the work as a result of our parking study. The parking study did have a short section on neighborhood parking and the needs to have a functional street. So that will continue to be a factor in the future as we evaluate those programs. And it is likely that we'll need to revisit some of the parking zones that we currently have. And we do that over the course of the next year as we really start to implement that parking program.
Thank you.
And I'd like to address one other part of your question. Director Morley and his department have been very proactive in seeking grant funding. They currently have 2 grant requests out there. One would be specific to vegetation management in parks that we have as a stakeholder and as a land steward. And then the other one is for vegetation management along roadways in the wildland-urban interface to make sure that those areas are clear to vegetation. So they've been doing a very good job of trying to seek grant funding where they can.
Mr. Rennie.
Just a quick one. So this discussion we've had is really about evacuation routes, most of what I'm hearing, and that's part of one of our Annex 9 action items or plans, is it not?
That's correct. Annex 9 at the back of it had a matrix of all sorts of things that could be done in terms of recommendations to either help mitigate or prevent wildfire. One of the areas was to look at the development of a wildfire evacuation assessment, which we did. One of the really things we gleaned from that assessment is we have a lot of challenged areas in town. And so some of the immediate things we can do to try and alleviate those challenges is make sure that we have a code that makes it conducive for our residents to do the necessary vegetation management to, at a minimum, try to inhibit the spread of wildfire, or at least harden their own homes in the event of wildfire.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple. I'm not sure who would answer this. Many of the streets that are of greatest concern with respect to these issues are private, so in the hillside. So how can the town affect those private roads that are up in the hillside?
So I'll defer to
private roads up there.
the town attorney, but depending on the nature of the covenants when those developments were put into place, I don't necessarily know if they're absolved from making sure that roadways that could require egress of residents are not held to the same state standard that every other property is.
I would agree with that, but we might have challenges as one of the solutions, preventing parking on certain months might be difficult to do if they are private streets. We'd have to look at, which streets are and which ones aren't. And maybe Matt knows more in the hills. Most of them are private streets, have been through private developments, and they do have covenants that allow us to do certain things and not others.
And I believe our county representative would also like to speak to the item.
Within the weed abatement standards, any of the properties that are on private roads are required to maintain a 10-foot clearance on either side of the road. So on their side of the road, they're required to maintain 10 feet from the road. So if a private road doesn't have that roadside clearance, it could be referred to us and we can address it and ensure that it does maintain a 10-foot clearance on both sides.
Okay, thank you very much. Then Mr. Andrews, I just wanted to make sure that I understood as we go forward, the 100-foot defensible space is state law required.
That is correct. It is currently state law.
The 100-foot cross property is town discretion per state law.
Per state law, the town has discretion if they want to have language that goes beyond the property line.
Right. The staff is basically asking for an increase from 5 to 10 feet clearance.
Yeah, so currently the law is 10 feet, and when staff drafted that, we were really thinking in terms of an intensification within the first 5 feet, but in speaking with community members, it seemed as if it created a little bit of confusion, and so we're just recommending to have it at 10 feet to keep it all consistent.
And finally, with the tree ordinance, it's my understanding that the exemption is simply for the permitting process where a tree is in the very high fire, I forget what the acronym is, but is in the extreme fire danger zone that would be required to be cleared, or at least not cleared, but defensible space created horizontally and vertically in that zone. You'd be exempt from permitting requirements, except if you're a heritage or listed tree in other areas of the code, correct?
Partially correct. So the way the code reads is it says the following trees are accepted from the provisions of this division. And so that means anything listed under here would be exempted from all provisions. That would include permitting. That would include in instances where you have to replant a certain number of trees in order to replace a tree that was removed. But then staff wanted to make sure that we carved out these other trees that were identified in the scope of protected trees section under section 3, which includes blue oak, black oak, California buckeye, and Pacific madrone, and then under section 10, heritage trees and large protected trees.
Okay, and the replacement requirement is only if a tree is going to get pruned or removed based upon the requirement for defensible space? I can't just take a tree out and not replant it willy-nilly. I have to be doing it because of the fire safety requirement.
Correct.
Okay.
We're only identifying trees that need some type of either removal or modification because they've been given advice that to have appropriate defensible space, this tree should either be removed or modified.
Okay, Ms. Spector.
Thank you. Following up on the roadway question, roadways on private property. In listening to the responses, it seemed as though those responses were referencing more urbanized but narrow streets. What about the narrow roadways up at the top of the mountains or hillsides? What can we do, if anything, about those?
Again, based on what the county said, we'd still be able to enforce any of the weed abatement, any weeds or debris or any the thing needs to be done on the private property. As for the roads, they're private roads, so we'd have to look at the original deeds, and there might not be anything we can do with those roads as far as widening, or with regards to maintenance of them, or with regards to ticketing. But it's something that we can look into, but I just don't know the answer of what we can do on private roads that we don't maintain or don't regulate.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? All right, I've got a couple cards. Rob Stump.
Most of you by now know my name is Rob Stump. I live about halfway up Foster Road in an area that we call the Civic Center Hillside neighborhood. I, along with a couple of other neighbors, one who's sitting here tonight, Mike Shields and John Whitty, basically as a leadership team, manage that group of 43 hillside owners. Homeowners. Our goal is to ensure we collectively take actions to both prevent and prepare for the eventuality of wildfire. I'm here tonight to speak in support of all of these amendments, Chapter 9, Chapter 11, Chapter 29. Chapter 9, addressing defensible space along property lines, is a major step in prevention of wildfires and related property damage. While it requires county fire determination of the need for defensible space along property lines, this change recognizes that fire does not recognize property lines. Chapter 9, along with Chapter 49 from the California Fire Code with town amendments, will make our community safer in the long run. Also, the 5-foot non-flammable zone around structures will save homes from fire. In Chapter 11, the expanded definition of weeds by the town was a good move back in November. The recommendation of the expansion from 5 to 10 feet is also a good measure. It aligns with other roadway clearance code requirements. Chapter 29. Let me first say that the folks that live up in the hillside, we love our trees. We live in an urban forest, but the forest on private land still has to be managed. What has been described here tonight will be of big benefit in addressing defensible space, which we've heard over and over is mandated, even though not everybody is complying, it is mandated. So we appreciate that, and also the other provisions of the amendment that recognize flexibility within the defensible space zone are well-reasoned and thought out. Over a dozen neighbors, even tonight as I was coming, sent me emails of support saying, hey, please tell the council we're with you. So these amendments set forward a framework, and it gets us back to priorities. Defensible space implementation, glad to hear about the education website. Again, I come back and say we need to consider hiring a defensible space inspector, not an enforcement agent, but an inspector to move things forward. Set goals for percentage of defensible space, compliance in our community, let's get a goal. And our goal should be, as you heard here, neighbors working with neighbors. You know, the carrot, not the stick, so that we can work with each other for defensible space. Nobody wants to be that source of ignition. Enhanced vegetation management. We've got to implement modified shaded fuel break for all public roads in the very high fire hazard zone. I also agree with private roads. We're all connected, and we've got to figure out how to work together. And we've got to reduce trim cycle from 5 to 7 years. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Stump? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mike Shields.
Good evening. My name is Mike Shields. I live at 17980 Foster Road near the top. I'm part of the Leadership Council with Rob for the Civic Center Hillside. I'm here to speak in support of the amendment to Chapter 9, specifically Section 4907.3, defensible space along property lines. I'm going to give you a very specific example as to why. Back in 2005, I bought a house up on the hillside. It was an older house. It was not in very good shape. The intent was always to remodel it and bring it up to today's standards. So here we are, 2020, and we're finally getting around to finishing it. We've done it all with permits. The planning department has been great to work with. And we've put in, just to give you some ideas, fire-resistant siding, fire-resistant roof. We're widening the driveway so fire trucks can get down. We've put in a sprinkler system. I've taken out trees, all with permits, even though we're up there and permits are still required. I've taken that out. So we've done a lot of things to try to make that house a significant reduction in the source of any wildfires. But there's some things I can't do, and let me show you what those are. Great. Okay, so that is my house, and the red line is my property line. What's above it here is one property.
So, Mr. Shields, you can actually take that microphone out with you, and then we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, so this property is owned by a neighbor above me. The property below is owned by the neighbor below me. For the most part, they've been great to work with, and the trees here have been thinned out. We've created a lot of defensible space. We've laddered or trimmed up the trees. We've taken out a lot of the brush. Wherever possible, I've been able to do that when I'm working with the neighbors. But in some cases, I can't. Like down through here, it's very thick. I can't control the neighbors. The neighbors will not allow me to take some of the trees out. So you can see the trees are encroaching on my house. I've taken many of those out with permits, but there's some things I cannot do. And that's why I'm here in support of the amendment to Chapter 9.
Questions for Mr. Shields? Thank you. David Weissman.
I emphasized from the outset that I am on board regarding defensible space. I have spent several $1,000s in the last 2 years on defensible space improvements on my property because I live in a very high fire zone. But staff's draft for Section 29 now creates a new problem, which I don't see addressed. What to do about screening trees in A&S hillside applications. and what to do about already approved ANS applications that designated screening trees and protected such designated trees in legal documents. I suspect that a large number of past and future screening trees are situated within Zone 1, within 30 feet of the house. I also suspect that the overwhelming majority of screening trees on all hillside properties are situated within 100 feet of the house. I see two potential solutions to this obvious conflict. The easiest solution is to modify the visibility analysis methodology, which we just revised, such that early in the ANS process, potential screening trees will be identified and designated. Single, isolated trees 10 or more feet from the house appear acceptable with defensible space guidelines, but 2 or more group trees within 100 feet of the house would be a defensible space problem, and such trees should be exempt from counting as screening trees from the start of the ANS process, since after the house is built, the owner can then return to the town for their removal because they pose a fire risk. Alternatively, on page 4 of the staff report, staff points out how exception categories 2 and 10 will not be exempted from the new proposal. By simply adding subcategory 6 as also exempt from these revisions, then the following would happen. Once a protected tree, then always a protected tree. Personally, I prefer option 1, which would be to modify the visibility methodology. I think that's easiest from the start.
Mr. Rennie?
Question, Dr. Weissman. So I realize that some of it is about separating trees, but a lot of it is about limbing up the trees so that you have the defensible space really from, the ladder so bushes can't get to the top of the tree. If we are, instead of removing trees, we're really limbing them up and getting that space there, do you think that's going to maintain the visibility shield that we're looking for? Or is that going to be a problem?
In some cases, it could. They talk about limbing up, I think it's 8 feet, and that's what I did with a lot of my trees. I limbed them up to 8 feet. And certainly early in the ANS process, that could be, you could go out, you could, in your mind, limit up 8 feet. If it still provides screening, then that tree, that would be appropriate to keep it as screening.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Ms. Sayak? Okay, if it's a staff question. Any questions for Dr. Weissman? Thank you, sir. I have no other cards. Okay, I'm going to close the public hearing. And Ms. Sayak, you have a question.
So this is to staff. So given Dr. Weissman's comments, based on what I've heard, I'm also in agreement of how can we work up front before we begin any planning with architectural and design. Is it possible to work with arborists before we even get into architectural design to see what is, given what we just passed, what can be trimmed, and then move forward so that we know what would actually be a screening tree and what wouldn't? Do we have to change policies, or can that be like a protocol that staff has? So.
Thank you, Joel Paulson, Community Development Director. So as Dr. Weissman mentioned, the first step would really be to modify the visibility analysis and the hillside development standards and guidelines, and we can work through those specifics as we discuss and consider those modifications would be my initial suggestion.
So just to follow up then, so then it doesn't require action on our part tonight that's something that staff can move forward with?
Yes, I think what we're interested in is moving forward with the ordinances before you this evening, and then we'll look at our other guidance documents and look at the practical implementation, and there may be additional items that may need to come to policy committee and then ultimately to council.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor. Question probably for Mr. Schultz. It's more about how we police the ordinance. We have two letters from residents on Foster Road that are concerned about the continuation over the property line for the 100 feet. I believe usually the way we look at things is we try to work with people and get voluntary compliance rather than coming at them hard and, in a way that people are going to get upset. So the question is, I assume you're going to have some process where you're going to take a light hand to start before we do any kind of heavy-handed. And then the second part of the question is, I've already forgot the gentleman's name. Shields, yes, thank you. So he had a question with his neighbors where they didn't want to remove trees. I can see it getting down to a discussion of, no, that's not necessary, yes, it is necessary kind of thing. Are we able to bring the fire department in to make the final determination of how much is the right amount to do? So
Yes.
go ahead with all of that.
Yes, first one is yes, absolutely, we won't be heavy-handed. We'll have outreach, and we'll continue, as we do with all code enforcement cases, try to get voluntary compliance. Litigation and court action is the last resort and is rarely used. We can almost always get voluntary compliance. I think, as Arn mentioned, and Mr. Andrews did in his, is that, yes, that determination, if there is a dispute between the neighbor that can't get resolved, couldn't be by staff either, then can be referred for the fire, because the fire department is going to be the one that will determine what that defensible space should be and what should be done.
So we should feel comfortable that we can go ahead and keep this in the ordinance, then we'll be able to work through difficulties.
It's another layer of regulations that, requires oversight, and that's always a concern with, one code enforcement officer or 1.5 code enforcement officer in my department, but we'll still work through those issues because, as has been said, it's a state mandate. We've got to put it in there and find a way to work through these issues.
Thank you.
And I'll just add, certain communities who have adopted recommendations like this, one of the tools they actually have on their website is kind of like a good neighbor policy. They actually have draft letters that neighbors can send to other neighbors that kind of strike the right tone of the first inquiry about it,
That's a great idea.
Yeah, so once we know what the legislative lay of the land is after council's action tonight, we will craft materials that will align with that, and we'll also use some of the materials that have currently been used in these other communities who have already kind of found their way through some of these, challenges that may or may not exist based on the ordinance.
Thank you.
Ms. Sayak.
Mr. Andrews, in the research that you've done in these toolkits, are there financial resources accessible for neighbors that may not have the means at this time to do any of this abatement?
For folks like ourselves who are getting progressive and serious about fire abatement, you see 3 types of grant programs that are usually developed. One is a grant program that tries to help folks that don't have the economic wherewithal to remove cedar shake roofs, for instance. Communities will try to come up with a policy that we want total elimination of cedar shake roofs or any type of wooden roof material. And for folks that don't have the economic means, there's some type of grant program put together to help facilitate that. You'll see grant programs that revolve around either some type of annual chipping, kind of a community vegetation management event where if, neighbors get out there and start clearing brush along the roadway, the town will then provide some type of chipping mechanism, and you see grant programs around that. You will also see grant programs where, for instance, Mill Valley has a very progressive ordinance that they've recently done, and they have a 100% eucalyptus eradication program. And so they have a grant program that will help folks that don't have the economic means to eliminate eucalyptus on their property. So you see it around actual tree removal, which can get costly. You see it around trying to get rid of cedar shake roofs or flammable materials in construction, and you'll see it around community-type chipping programs.
Anything else? Okay, thank you. I have a procedural question before we start with our debate and our motions. The staff is indicating that each one of the suggested amendments, Mr. Schultz, you're nodding, for each chapter, chapter 49, 11, and 29, needs its own motion and reading, correct?
That is correct.
But so we have to do them separately. We cannot, okay. All right, that said, do I have any motions? Ms. Sayak.
Okay. I move to introduce an ordinance by title only affecting an amendment to Chapter 9, which is fire prevention and protection of the town code regarding defensible space regulations.
Second.
It's moved and seconded. Any discussion? I just going to do a tiny discussion because we did get communication regarding perceived problems with property rights, and I just wanted to indicate that the primary reason under the law that jurisdictions can do anything by way of regulation is to promote the general health, safety, and welfare. And so if there is a regulation that promotes health, safety, and welfare, it is this. And as Mr. Stump very appropriately pointed out, the fire is not going to stop at a property line. And so I will be supporting the motion. So all in favor? Aye. Passes unanimously. You want to keep going?
Sure. Introduce an amendment by title. Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to read them. Okay.
An ordinance of the Town Council of the Town of Los Gatos amending Chapter 9, Fire Prevention and Protection of the Town Code regarding weed abatement regulations.
Okay, so I move to introduce an amendment to Chapter 11 of the Town Code regarding weed abatement regulations by title only.
Second.
It's moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Ms. Neese?
An ordinance of the Town Council of the Town of Los Gatos amending Chapter 11, Garbage, Refuse, and Weeds of the Town Code regarding weed abatement regulations.
Okay, and then I move to introduce an ordinance by title only affecting amendment to Chapter 29, which is tree protection of the Town Code regarding exemptions for defensible space, with the understanding that staff will work through implementation and see how this may affect other of our policies. So.
Second.
It's moved and seconded with the noted explanation. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor? Aye, passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Oh, Ms. Neese.
An ordinance of the Town Council of the Town of Los Gatos amending Chapter 29, Tree Protection of the Town Code regarding weed abatement regulations.
Okay, we'll move on to item number 11. Thanks everyone that came in on item number 10. Okay. Item 11 is our first formal go-round on developing policies, recommendations, and procedures for a changeover in analysis of traffic impacts, greenhouse gas impacts, environmental impacts generally, to an assessment of vehicle miles traveled versus, for example, level of service at intersections. And so as we work through this, we have a number of steps to go through where we will determine methodology, thresholds, implementation, et cetera, in conjunction also with our general plan update. So with that, Mr. Morley.
Thank you very much. I promise to bring you lots of decision points and action items on vehicle miles traveled over the course of the next several months. Unfortunately, tonight, this is more informative to you as we try and set the stage for those future conversations. So this will be a receive a report item. So at the end of the discussion, when your questions are answered, feel free to dismiss me and we'll move on. I wanted to talk a little bit about vehicle miles traveled, vehicle miles traveled is a new standard for CEQA analysis. There continues to be a need, even with vehicle miles traveled, to manage our local streets and to be able to control what's going on our local streets. And so with that, I wanted to define what vehicle miles traveled is. And it's actually, if you think about it, pretty simple. It's how many miles a vehicle travels in relation to the impact of a development. So one vehicle mile traveled is 1 mile. For new developments, we'll be measuring that, and that will set the CEQA impact for us, and we'll mitigate to that. The new look at CEQA looks at how we change the project for those vehicle mile travels and how to do the mitigation with respect to the project. Whereas previously with our traffic analysis, we had looked more at what we can do to our town roads to change the roads to handle the additional traffic. So we would do things like widen streets or add turn lanes, things like that. So it's a different look at it. It's doing things like requiring bus passes for a development so that they take miles off of the road and change that look at a development. the big element is the previous look had been at level of service or how we can affect delay, and so that had become awkward over time. The vehicle miles traveled is again a different way to look at this. Let me catch up to my notes here. So we want to look at these vehicles that are on a development. As they're coming off of the development, as we're reducing the amount of miles that they travel, we also know that they're going to be on our roads. So, for example, a vehicle with a development might travel in Los Gatos an average of 18 miles. So we'll want to pare down that 18 miles of miles traveled. But we also know that in the course of those miles, it's going to hit some of our intersections, some of our roadways. And we'll need to manage that on a continual basis. Because the LOS has been vehicle-centric in the past, we want to take a broader look at that. And so another aspect that we'll bring to you in coming months is a look at a stress for all users on the roadway. So, for instance, bicyclists and pedestrians have been ignored in the past. With a wider street or a wider intersection, the bicyclists and pedestrians actually have a harder time, and we'll want to consider that in our future analysis. So that will be another one of those future decision points for the council. There have been some conceptions that vehicle miles traveled would actually do away with the need for a traffic analysis, and we wanted to make sure that you understood tonight that that's not the case. We'll still need that traffic analysis for the future, and that traffic analysis will tell us what we need to do on our roadways. So we'll continue to measure in different ways through our standard processes and through other processes that evolve over time as vehicle miles travel becomes the new standard and the alternative ways come into play. So with that, that'll conclude my report, and happy to support any questions.
So before I go to council for questions, I don't have any cards from the public on this item. I just want to make sure whether anyone wants to talk, because if they don't, I'm going to close the public hearing and just go to council questions. Okay, seeing no one, I'm going to close the public hearing and go to council questions. Mr. Benny.
I'm curious about this stress analysis. I hadn't seen that tied to vehicle miles traveled before. We were talking about a stress analysis of how safe the roadway feels for bicycles and pedestrians, and how do we measure something like that?
So there are a number of ways to measure it, and it's something, again, that is evolving. So the stress analysis will actually be a part, not of the vehicle miles traveled, but of the transportation analysis that we do in parallel with that. So how the impacts of a development hit our local roadways. And we would measure at a particular intersection the delay, for example, the delay of a bicyclist or pedestrian, how the conditions are set up to help them through an intersection, how much traffic, how many lanes of traffic do they have to cross. There's a number of accepted methods for measuring that, and we'd bring those back to you for future review and for your comment and input on as we modify our traffic analysis process for the future.
Thank you.
Ms. Sayak?
Mr. Morley, so I want to make sure I just understand this. So in the short term, you're recommending that we keep our traffic impact policy. But in July, once we move towards VMT, would we keep the level of service and VMT, or would one supersede the other?
Yeah, so for the short term, we would keep a level of service analysis until we're able to bring back to you some modifications, and we'll change the nomenclature to transportation analysis as opposed to a level of service analysis. So we'll want to look at the entire network and how it affects all users as opposed to simply the automobiles. So a level of service, because it is measuring the delay at an intersection for vehicles, is very, very limited in its evaluation. So we'll want to expand that,
okay.
And we'll bring that back to you for decision making following the adoption of the VMT.
Okay.
Other questions? Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Probably more in the weeds kind of question, but what the heck. The VMT talks about references transit passes. And I am assuming the concept is if there aren't enough parking spaces in the development, you give a pass, and then we get to the question. The transit passes are issued, but there's no methodology, I would assume, to see if they're actually used. So it's just going to measure the issuance and not whether or not they're used.
So yeah, all great information that we'll get into over the course of the next couple of meetings when we bring these items to you. I'll give you a sort of a high-level answer, and we can dig in really deep on this, because this is the fun part of it, and is figuring all this out. So there is an analysis, a measurement for what credit a development gets for reducing vehicle miles traveled by issuing transit passes. So I use that 18 vehicle miles traveled as a basis for Los Gatos. Maybe by issuing transit passes, a development is able to take a % off of that 18 and reduce it a little bit. So they would get credit for that. And then over the course of time, that would be measured as one of the standards that they need to abide by. And so there is a follow back on that to make sure that they are compliant.
Thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Morley, I have one, just to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. As I understand, as we shift to a vehicle miles traveled analysis, the vehicle miles traveled changes our focus to mitigation measures, if you will, that are within or can be caused by the project itself, i.e. a transit demand management plan, a pass, bus, whatever it may be, whereas we've traditionally been looking at it as what happens outside of the project, i.e. do I have to widen the street, whatever it is. So
That's
you're nodding
correct.
at me, is that right? So as we go through and figure out the methodology we want to use through the analysis, I think I understood you to say we want to look at two things. One is how we manage the project itself with respect to reducing vehicle miles traveled, and the other is how we then manage our streets around that, even though, because now we're focusing for our analysis inside the project, if you will, rather than out. So that's the reason for the bifurcated process, at least for now?
That's correct, and probably into the future. So the VMT analysis will be our CEQA element associated with our environmental clearance for our project. And then the transportation analysis will be our impact analysis by local code, local policies. So it's a local look at impacts on one hand, and then a statewide look from a CEQA analysis on the other.
Okay, and then following up on my own little question, coming forward, you're going to bring us information where we'll decide how we want to determine our methodology for the vehicle miles traveled, how we want to determine impact thresholds, whether we want to exempt any particular kind of project from the screening, and what our mitigations options are, so that those will be coming to the council as we go forward with this?
Those are coming over the next couple of months, yes.
Okay, thank you. I saw other hands up. No, so what, Ms. Zach?
So I'm curious, when it comes back to us, let's take the broad category of exemptions. Is there, I want to be mindful, are there best practices that you and the consultant will be providing so that there's a rationale behind the exemptions that we're looking at versus, not exempting anything and saying it's causing traffic?
Yes, for everything, we'll bring you a staff recommendation and
Okay.
options and some support for all of that, including best practices, what other jurisdictions of similar size are doing, so that you have a whole basis of items to set your decisions on.
And also things that come back, would it also trigger, what I'm trying to be mindful of is in past projects, when people will say, well, this project, we use Institute Traffic, ITE, and it has the use and it has the traffic analysis. Do we still follow statewide analysis, or will we be able to look at more regional examples that is more true to life to what we're experiencing here in Los Gatos?
So two separate parts of the response to that. One is the IT is the national standard right now, and I know we don't necessarily always like it, but it is what is used throughout the country, and so it provides us a solid basis for making decisions because of that. We will bring back some examples of projects that we've had locally where we've done a transportation analysis ahead of the project, and we have data afterwards. So you'll be able to see how far off or how close we are on those, and hopefully that'll give you a little bit more comfort with the analyses that have been done in the past.
Anything else? I just want to make sure on page 2 of our staff report, the paragraph just above conclusion, you're actually are recommending that we maintain our current traffic impact policy. Do you want any kind of consensus motion or agreement with respect to that? Or are the comments that you got this evening adequate?
I don't think we need it. So as we talk about VMT, the decisions will build upon each other, and I think it'll all start to gel and come together as we hit that June timeframe, preparing for a July 1st implementation. At that point, I think you can give us pretty concrete direction then on what you want to see for the transportation analysis that we'll bring back following the summer.
Anything else? Okay, thank you, Mr. Morley. Okay, we're going to move to item 12, which is asking us to, quote, discuss, unquote, the 5-year forecast, provide direction on current budget assumptions, and provide any specific direction regarding budget items. So with that, Mr. Andrews, I think you are giving us a report.
Yep. Thank you, Mayor and Town Council. I'm going to give a very brief overview, and then our finance professionals are in the room, our finance director and our budget manager, and they'll be available as we move into specific conversations. But at a very high level, the first thing I'd like to do is just orient people to Attachment 1. Attachment 1 is an illustration of the annual budget CAFR cycle, and tonight is another step along the way in that cycle. You'll recall back in December that this council received the annual CAFR, the audited CAFR, and through that audit, surpluses were assigned per the current council reserve policy. On the 14th, the council then had a discussion around their strategic priorities, and that's another way to start to inform the community and inform staff of where we think the ultimate budget direction would like to go. And then tonight is another tool in what is ultimately the goal to develop a recommended proposed budget and then move forward with adoption of a budget. Tonight's tool is what's referred to as the 5-year forecast. The 5-year forecast is exactly that. It's a summation of a lot of variables and a lot of information that staff tries to put together in a way for council to get an appreciation of what types of policies may or may not be realistic in the foreseeable future. There might be constraints associated with some longer-term policies, or there could be constraints associated with any discussion about staff augmentation, and that is exactly what it's intended to do. And then staff, starting last year and continuing this year, wanted the council and the community to appreciate kind of exactly how susceptible we are to variabilities in the economy. And so we created 2 additional cases to our base case, which is kind of a lower growth scenario, and then also a greater growth scenario. And the summary table, which was updated in your desk item, shows kind of that variability. If you look at our base case, which assumes modest growth, you see minor surpluses and then modest surpluses throughout the 5-year forecast. However, when you start to do any type of sensitivity analysis to 3 of our primary revenues and then 1 of our primary expense drivers, that being costs associated with our pension plans, you can see that in a greater growth scenario, those surpluses grow, which is great. But in a lower growth scenario where we start to see impacts to our property tax, our sales tax, and we start to see CalPERS missing their investment return, you can see that surpluses will start to develop fairly quickly. So one of the other objectives tonight is to also show council that based on that adoption of the CAFR back in December, through the reserve policies currently adopted, if you turn to page 16 of 17, you can see that when it comes to the general fund capital special project reserve, where any unallocated funds flow to, we currently have an audited balance from the CAFR of $13,262,303. Staff has gone ahead and programmed a modest addition to the CIP budget over the 5-year period, and then based on previously approved council allocations, we really have a balance in that reserve of about $4 million, which has previously been unallocated. If council were inclined to want to reallocate those dollars, that is certainly within your purview, but we would like to caution that those dollars traditionally work on CIP projects, and without them, there really is no other identified source of funding. However, those are unallocated reserves, and we want council to understand that those monies are fungible in that sense. So with that, as I mentioned, we just wanted to give a high overview of what the intent of the forecast is. It's one more tool along the way to adopting a budget. And as I mentioned, our Director of Finance and our Budget Manager are here to address any specific questions.
Okay, any preliminary, well, I'm going to just ask a fundamental question first. To the extent that the council wishes to reprogram the $4 million, is what you're looking for tonight just yes, we're interested, not a specific direction, or are you looking for a specific direction?
Specific direction would be very helpful.
Okay, thank you.
And while we're discussing specific direction, you know, in the past, one of the reasons we made this document much more informative last year is because I don't know if people fully appreciated some of the variables that are already built into the development of the budget, whether it's cost escalators or even how we budget for staffing. And so in the memo is a very comprehensive discussion of how we budget for staffing. And in the desk item addressing some of the questions from the community, you know, we mentioned that if the council were inclined to want to consider something like a vacancy factor, we give some estimates of what that would actually bring forward in terms of saving. In an organization our size, vacancy factor doesn't really equate into a lot of additional surplus dollars, but we thought it was a data point that the council would like to receive.
Okay, thank you. Preliminary questions, Mr. Bunny.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to make sure I understand where the $4 million is coming. So one example would be, I know twice we've put money aside for downtown streetscape changes. I believe we're in the $2 million range. Is that $2 million part of this $4 million, or is that somewhere else?
That money has already been programmed in the CIP, so it is separate from the $4 million we're discussing this
So the
evening.
$4 million, truly, we've never indicated we wanted to put it anywhere in the past.
That's correct. So right now, it's sitting in the Capital Special Projects Reserve per our general fund reserve policy. But as we discussed last week and also in December, the council could choose to reallocate it away from capital projects to other priorities. In addition, the council could say, we want $4 million for capital, and in particular, as you develop the next capital budget, we would like you to focus on vegetation management, bike ped, whatever your capital priorities might be.
Thank you.
Other preliminary questions? Ms. Spector.
Thank you. I think this is akin to what the mayor was saying, but I look at the staff report and it says provide direction, and then it says provide specific direction. So I am trying to understand what exactly we're being asked to do tonight. We're not doing the budget, so we're not deciding what we're going to pay for X, Y, or Z. So is it, other than the addressing the $4 million, which is on page 16, is there anything specific that you are looking for, or are you saying, well, council, is there anything general you want to talk about?
Thank you for the question. This is another tool that is intended to help inform the council as we do start moving towards the adoption and the recommendation of a proposed budget. And so in terms of specifics, the $4 million in terms of dollars is really the only area we're looking for specifics. But over the years, we've had extensive conversations with our community about trying to create more transparency, which is definitely a good goal. And so last year, we really started trying to enhance this document to show the base case considers modest growth, 3% increases in property tax in line with what the assessor seems to think. Muni Services provides estimates of sales tax. CalPERS provides some estimates if they don't achieve their investment return. And so we wanted council to have an opportunity to say that, you know, staff has done good due diligence. We concur with your assessment of the current environment and your base case scenario. Or it is an opportunity for the council to challenge staff and say, well, maybe we should consider a vacancy factor, something we've never done in the past. And so as we build the budget's going to be built on a whole host of variables and assumptions. First, we want to daylight all those assumptions to our community and to our council. And then second, we do want to see some form of concurrence. Last year, when we did this document for the first time, council concurred with staff's assessment. But annually, we want to make sure the council has an opportunity to weigh in on how we're going to build and draft the budget. I believe the town manager might have other comments.
Right. I just also want to add, again, in the past, the council has asked, well, when can we discuss budget assumptions? When can we discuss whether or not we budget at top step versus at actual steps? So this is your opportunity to weigh in on those assumptions. And in the attachments, we detailed out our expenditure assumptions as well as our revenue assumptions. So this is really the time that if you believe that our methodology needs to change or should change, you know, we would need to know that now so that we could build the budget according to your preferences. So it's really, we don't have any specific areas where we're recommending changes, but given that this council has asked in the past for the opportunity to weigh in on those assumptions, tonight is the night.
Okay, I want to just follow up on your explanation. Thank you very much, both of you. That makes sense now. So if I look at the recommendation, then discuss the 5-year forecast, fine. Provide direction on other budget assumptions. Those are the broad categories that we are seeing in this staff report that create the assumptions that go into building a budget later on, correct? Those are the ones you're asking us to provide general direction on. Do we agree? Do we not agree? And the only specific direction you want is with respect to the $4 million, correct?
To provide it, yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor. I do have another question. I was trying to understand, so is it for the 2021 year that we still have labor contract, but we have to renegotiate the amount, or is that this year?
It's our current, we are negotiating for a July 1 start. So it would be,
the
and
2021.
It's only compensation for our 3 bargaining units.
And our current contract says it's supposed to go up how much for that year?
It doesn't.
It doesn't. It just says we're supposed to figure out what it's going to do.
Correct.
So that means nothing has been programmed into this number for 2021 then?
That's correct.
And how much did it go up last year? Was it 2.5%?
3%.
3%. So
that was the COLA.
We might expect something in that range again?
It's too early to say. Negotiations have not yet started.
Could you tell us what does a 1% or 2% increase do to this then?
We will have that information available for town council in closed session. We don't have it for you this evening.
Okay, thank you.
Any other preliminary questions? Okay, I do have 2 cards, but one is in absentia. So Rick Tinsley.
Thank you. Terry Duryea is out of town. He asked me to read this note on his behalf. Terry writes, I asked the town council to request town staff to adopt the GFOA's best practices for effective budgeting of salary and wages. This requires the town to change the assumptions they have used in the past when budgeting salary and wages. Currently, the town budgets salary at the top of the wage scale for all employees. Per the GFOA, and I quote, it encourages every government to consider forecasting procedures that would result in more accurate expenditure projections, especially as they relate to personnel. The GFOA adds, quote, a consequence of slowing revenues is the need for greater control over expenditures. I included a list of the GFOA's best practices as an appendix to the letter that was distributed with item 12 materials to the council. In summary, they include adjustments for expected vacancies, start dates for open positions, and normal attrition and retirements. You can see the intent is for the budget to reflect expected salaries, not a theoretical maximum of the top of wage scale. Salary and benefits are the most significant portion of the town's budget, representing over 70% of the town's total operating costs. The 5-year trended salaries and benefits have been growing at a faster rate than other expenditures. Salary and benefits in the current budget are 45% higher than they were in fiscal 15-16, while total expenditures are only 30% higher. The town's historic methodology for budgeting salary at the top of the scale results in town underspending budget by $2 to $3 million per year. You might say this is good. I would say it's only half good. It makes it impossible to monitor expense control and distorts resource allocation decisions. This cushion buried in the salary and wages provides funds at the end that can be added to reserves to fund special projects. I'm suggesting that the town continue to have a reserve in the budget. My request is for transparency, i.e. that the cushion not be buried in the town's largest cost category, salaries. Specifically, I'm asking the town council to ask staff to give transparency to the cushion. For example, it could be a separate budget item called reserve for mid-year adjustments, rather than just buried in salary and wages. My second request of the council is to ask town staff to break out the single number of salary and benefits into 3 numbers, one for salary and wages, one for pension costs, and one for OPEB costs. This greater transparency will make it easier to monitor the town staff's management of salary and wage costs and to understand the impact the increasing pension and OPEB costs are having on total employee costs. In summary, I'd like the town council to direct staff to, number 1, adopt GFOA best practices in budgeting for salary and wages in the 2021 budget, break out salary and benefit costs into the following 3 components: salary, pension, and OPEB costs. And a new request, finally, if you're not comfortable asking town staff to make these changes, ask the town staff to put this topic on the agenda for the February 3rd Finance Committee meeting. Respectfully submitted, Terry Duryea.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Duryea. Mr. Tinsley, and can you move the microphone just a little bit closer to you?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, shall I carry on with mine? I had 3 specific suggestions for this tool, this 5-year budget tool, which I think is a good tool, and it can be made better. Number 1, there's no history in this. Usually the first thing you do when you look at a budget projection is to say, well, how do these numbers compare with what we spent last year, what we actually spent last year, or maybe how will the next 5 years compare with the last 5 years? Trends are very important in finance, and without the benefit of history, it's hard to quickly identify how these numbers compare to the status quo or the historical trend. Second, functional breakdown. In this budget, we see we're going to spend $20 million on salary for all of our 149 town employees. It's not broken down anywhere in this document how much is for general government, how much is for police, library, community development, so forth. Those functional breakdowns we do have in the CAFRs after the fact. It's really important, I think, to have those in budgets. For instance, 10 years ago, back in the look, we spent about 30% of our total budget on the police force 10 years ago. This year, it'll probably cross 40%, and it's going to keep growing faster than the other departments, largely because of the heavy retirement cost burden we have with safety. I think that's important to identify that trend and recognize how it's ultimately going to impact other services in the town. And finally, page 5 of this document, 5 of 17, in the expense category, it's pretty confusing on the surface. It says we're going to spend $20 million in salary this year, in the current fiscal year, and we're not going to spend that much in any of the next 4 years. It's numbers less than 20. Now, we all know that's not right. I don't think we're planning to lay off a bunch of the town staff, which we would have to do to actually make those numbers come true. This gets back to the age-old problem of padding the current budget. And you can read the fine print on page 11, and it points out the current year is significantly padded. It's got that cushion, to use the staff's terminology. That's what they call it. But here we're budgeting with top step, 0 vacancies. Every conceivable job is filled at the maximum possible pay level, regardless of what reality is. Whereas the next 4 years are somewhat closer to reality. The irony is years 4 through 5 in this 5-year projection actually are more accurate from an expense forecast than the current 1920 fiscal year is. And this is why many of us have pointed out for some time we shouldn't do this padding exercise. Terry has a great suggestion. It's a better alternative to the way we've been doing it. But at a minimum, I would ask staff to, I would ask the council to direct staff to incorporate these improvements into the budget process going forward for 2021 and subsequent budget cycles. Thank you.
Questions for Mr. Tinsley? Thank you very much. I see Mr. Fagot holding a card, and I saw Ms. Owens hand in a card. So Ms. Owens?
Hi, Hi, I'm Heidi Owens. I have questions for you that you may want to pose to staff. Schools and Communities First is a ballot initiative that's polling very high. It will likely pass, and that will change the commercial property tax revenues that we'll be seeing. They'll assess commercial properties every 3 years, so that could increase our property tax income above and beyond the 3% that Larry Stone provided to staff. So what would the impact of that be on our revenues is a question you might want to pose to staff to include in the analysis. And then our fire contract is a straight percentage of property taxes, I understand from our town manager. So if our property tax revenues do go up with that ballot proposition, then our fire contract payment would just go straight up as well. So it might be something to consider decoupling the fire contract and make it more of a flat number versus a straight percentage of property taxes. So those are my questions that you might want to consider. Thanks.
Questions for Ms. Owens? You're running away, but you don't have any. That's okay. I'm just sorry.
Yeah, it's like.
No, you're done. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks.
Mr. Fagot.
Good evening, and thank you, Madam Mayor, council members, and staff for the opportunity to speak. I have to say, what I've just heard by Mr. Tinsley representing both Mr. Duryea and himself were the points that I think really speak to the proper process of budget planning. I endorse their comments and suggest that we go forward in that way. Having said that, I would also encourage the council to continue evaluating what the Finance Committee has been doing in terms of educating the town staff, the council, and the community on the critical financial issues of the town. And in fact, let's expand that role and go with 5, change it to a commission, have 5 well-qualified citizens on that commission to be a resource to assist the town staff, to help the council to set correct budgeting. The other part to that would be, as we heard from Mr. Duryea, is to change the way that we look at budgeting and not look at the 4 to 5 years past budget history and use that to help with projecting going forward, but rather look at actual numbers and use that as a history base to look forward and do the budget planning. Comparing budget history to budget projections is folly. A comment has been made by staff that in the past that we're comparing, if you're comparing actual to projected, that's comparing apples and oranges. But rather comparing budget to budget is comparing apples to apples. Well, in fact, that's not the case. You're comparing applesauce to applesauce, not apples to apples. Get something chewy that you can work on and compare. Maybe it is apples to orange. The actual numbers in the past really give you a sense of what has happened. You want to understand why and use that when you're projecting going forward and putting together a new budget. So that would be my suggestions and comments.
Any questions?
Again, I appreciate the outreach that's now underway as the town is planning its next 20-year plan, its mid-year review, and this budget for coming up for the next fiscal year.
Questions for Mr. Fagot? Thank you very much. I haven't seen anybody else with a card, and I don't have any more. So I'm going to close the public portion of the hearing. Look to the council for any other questions they may have and or comments. I guess generally I'm not going to try to break down your comments this meeting as I did last meeting. Ms. Spector.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a discrete question and not comments yet. For staff, with regard to the sales tax, and this will help me in at least my personal analysis, how much of our projected sales tax is as a result of the Wayfair decision, and how much is a result of Measure G?
Gita Ungvari, Finance and Budget Manager. The Wayfair decision is a little bit over $100,000 portion of the current sales tax estimates.
And Measure G?
Measure G is around $1 million.
And that 100,000 and 1 million, that is within what time frame? A year, what?
It's a year. It's within a year.
Thank you.
Since we're doing questions, any other questions? Okay, Ms. Sayak?
So, Director Conway, actually, for anyone, we've had the discussion at several meetings now about how we're actually budgeting salaries. And the last time we raised the question, you had made a comment that there aren't that many salaries remaining that are not at what is projected in the budget. Could you give me a rough percentage? Are we looking at 10% or less, so that we actually try and, so I can figure out how much padding really are we talking about?
Thank you, Councilmember Sayak. That's a great question. I actually anticipated that question because it has been an item that has been of interest in the public and from council. So our current steps, or where we have people at top step, is around 65% of our staff, including management, is at the top of their salary range. So we have another 35% that are either at some step lower than the top step. I wanted to remind council that we actually budget for our budget for the town practice has been in the past that for the public safety positions, we've always budgeted those positions at actual step. So we're really, the universe of people that we're talking about that we budget at top step are the non-public safety employees, including management that are non-public safety. So we've quantified that, and I believe in our desk item we gave an approximation of that. And I believe it's around $400,000 to $500,000 a year that we would have in anticipated step savings. And where I feel that's of value is, of course, that's a $400,000 to $500,000. The word is cushion. We don't really refer to it that way, but that has been a standard town practice since we don't have a dedicated revenue source for our capital program. If we had full employment, no vacancies, then we would expect that we would, at the end of a budget year, have approximately $400,000 to $450,000 available that we would then use as a funding source for the new capital initiatives that might result from. So that is one method. Can't say that that's the only way to do it. That is not, but it's been the town standard practice. But in order of magnitude, where we get the significant savings is when we have unanticipated vacancies that occur. We have a number of either retirements that we didn't anticipate or people leave, and we have extended vacancies and we can't recruit. Then you'll see savings in the salaries and benefit line item that are substantially more than the number I'm quoting.
So what I appreciate with all of these discussions is that I think all of us have a better understanding of our financing in the different buckets. So one suggestion was to be able to label this 400,000. Can you, and in many ways the discussion we're having today of the 4 million is the same type of bucket that could go to capital projects, but we're looking at, is there a better use of that funding? So if we were to allocate this 500,000, I'm just going to say cushion for lack of a better word, into a different name so that we know that it's potential savings from salaries that could go to capital reserves, or it could go to any other priorities we determine more appropriate next year. Is there a better way to just label it so that it's clear that these are the salary savings?
Am I on? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Sayak. I want to just state that my experience has been there are some cities that take that approach. There's no real easy answer for this. There is a wide variety of practice. Our policy to budget at top step is not, I would say it's not unusual. I know many cities that do this. There are other cities that take a vacancy factor and they build that into the budget. That has some upsides and some pitfalls. Some pitfalls I can advise council about. For instance, if you just take a department and you budget everyone at actual step in a non-public safety department, then you have a vacancy occur. Right now, since we have all departments that are non-public safety at top steps, so I think we've mentioned, we have latitude when we go out into the recruitment process. We can offer up to a top step for that position. If we, say, had someone at a step 1 and we budget that step at step 1 and they leave, if we offered step 2 or 3 or 4 above that, then we already will have exceeded the adopted budget in that department. So you have that issue. As usual, there's more complications to a simple statement than quickly come to mind. So one of the things that we would recommend if we did do that would be some flexibility to have budget adjustments to go in, and if we had to make some augmentations to a particular department because they had now hired at a higher step than the prior person that left, there'd be some flexibility. And vacancy factors also do affect, when you build that in, you of course have less budget available for salaries and benefits in any department. That money then gets reallocated in many instances to other priorities or other initiatives, and then you don't have adequate money in salaries and benefits to, if you're in a competitive marketplace, there's issues that arise from that. So our standard practice actually has worked, in my opinion, pretty well. We've had very robust funding of our capital program. We've had excellent funding for our OPEB. We've paid that down substantially. We have had excellent funding for our, made some sizable payments to our PERS obligation. All of those dollars came from budget and salary savings primarily in the years past. So I don't view it as a policy that's done any harm to the town. In fact, it's actually, I think, and from my point of view, my professional point of view, it's been very beneficial.
If I may, one thing we can do to your question about transparency and how we could perhaps better describe what that potential savings might be, that's something we could easily do in the proposed budget. So that way you could see, given, we can lay out our assumptions a lot more clearly about how many positions are currently at top step, what that vacancy is, and what the potential savings might be. However, again, we are in a very competitive market for talent, and so I think we would, from a budgeting standpoint, we would prefer to have the flexibility to bring in the top talent to serve the needs of this community. But I would be very happy in our budget document to continue to make the improvements as suggested by the public, as well as any additional ones by the council. So this is something that we could certainly elaborate on in the budget while maintaining the same assumption approach. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Rennie, before I go to you, I just want to, on the same topic, Mr. Andrews, because you were explaining to us page 16 of 17, the chart at the bottom, which refers to the 4 million. And if I look across the bottom each year, it says 550,000, 550,000, 550,000 for potential capital improvements. Is that the 500,000 that Mr. Conway was just referring to that comes out of the savings, or is that a different source of funds?
So that's a different source of funds. Staff, just at a very conservative level, said at a bare minimum, if the only thing we allocated was 550,000 per year towards the CIP, they've already deducted that from the 13,262,303. That's the only assumption that's been made by staff. That is not an allocation that's been made by council. And just on some of the previous comments, apologies, but staff was working this afternoon to try and answer a lot of the public comment we got and try and give, sufficient answers both to the public and to council. Both of the questions that came up at the dais were actually responded to in the desk item when council gets an opportunity to review it. The director of finance already spoke to one of them. It actually comes out to about $283,500 in savings if we were to go full above the 65% that's already at top step, the other 35%, it works out to about that in savings. And then also there were some responses that were provided in regards to kind of GFOA best practices, and not to steal their thunder, but they did receive word today from GFOA that they will receive the awards again for their CAFR and for their budget document. And then for Councilmember Syak, just to help put it in perspective, the base case chart on page 11 of 17, which talks about the salary, if you just look at the first year, 2020, 2021, 19.4 million. When we talk about using a vacancy factor, if we decided to use a 2% vacancy factor, you basically just multiply that number by 98%. And so if you just think of it in round numbers, it's about 390,000. And so the vacancy factor reduces your forecast of expenditure. Depending on all the other variables, it may or may not roll down to a surplus, but it would reduce the assumption for expenditure using a vacancy factor.
Sorry, Mr. Rennie, go ahead.
So, thank you, Mayor. This is an illustration of why there's a problem with the budget versus forecast, because the first thing Mr. Conway says, oh, we're saving 400 to 500,000 on top step, and I look at what we put for budgeted. This is page 5 of 17, I believe it is, yes. So for budgeted salaries in 1920, this year it says 20 million, and this was mentioned by a speaker, and then it says next year it's forecasted at 19.4. So what would be better in this is if we had, okay, you say budgeted 1920, but then you then had a forecast, because the first thing when you told me it was 400 to 500, I looked and I said, no, I don't believe you, because you're forecasting 19.4 next year and it goes up 1 or 2 each year. So I'm guessing this year, if you forecasted, it would have been 19.3, which is actually a difference of 700,000 instead of 500,000. So, why is it 500 and not the 700? And then it also helps to illustrate why the way you've set this up with budget versus forecast doesn't work.
Thank you, Councilmember Rennie. Got to remember that when we do this 5-year forecast, we round these numbers round either up or down. So it could be if you're talking 500,000, it can round. We've generally have found that there is some swing factor between 300,000 to 500,000. So it's in the ballpark. We looked at that for reasonableness. But you're right. You would think that I should be able to quantify that and get that a little closer, and we will. But so the forecast shows, you're right, you look at that, and it's a $20 million budget this fiscal year. And then when we looked at our actual salaries and benefits for this year and project that into the next fiscal year, we show a 19.4 million actual projected cost. Also remember that the PERS rates did change. We just updated those a couple weeks ago, so they were different for the adopted budget. That's another reason it just came to my mind. So it's a little bit of an apples to orange comparison. Unfortunately, when we did the adopted budget, we used the PERS rates, which were given to us as estimates last May, and then we just recently updated them with the actuarial report that we received in November, I believe. And we used those numbers to put in the forecast, so we'd have the most recent PERS cost in this forecast number.
Did the PERS go down from our?
The PERS slightly increased.
So that makes it even worse. So the 20.
It's about 10, yeah.
So the 20's even further down from 20, right? It should be 19.2.
Yeah, we'll have to.
Something.
I can tell you that the 19.4 we're very solid about, and we'd have to really look line item, employee by employee at the amounts in the 20 million adopted budget, and we could come back at a later point and explain that difference.
So I think the point is, rather than trying to guess at what the difference is, it would have been better to not be trying to compare a budgeted this year to a forecasted in the future kind of thing. If, when you make these, we could do, okay, here's our forecast for this year. You can also put the budget line, but have the forecast for it. I have another question, though. I've been trying to understand where the $4 million came from, because I thought we've mostly been, when we've had surpluses, we've been allocating them to various things. And not a lot was flowing into the capital reserve. You know, we're allocating it for pensions. We put some for downtown streetscapes. We increased how much we put into roads and, you know, various things. And not a lot was flowing in there. And it was either last year or the year before, we looked at our capital forecast and said, you know, over the next 5 years, we need some number much larger than what we have. All of a sudden, you're telling me we have more money than our capital 5-year capital forecast. So this is confusing to me. When a couple of years ago we were saying we were short, we need to add a tax in the town to make sure we were able to meet that, and then all of a sudden we have this excess. So I'm really confused where it came from.
Councilmember Murray, this question comes up on almost an annual basis. It's a little difficult to explain in some respects because typically what happens under our current general fund reserve policy, when we have an excess of revenue and expense, we have excess revenues that then get placed into various reserves in the general fund according to the general fund reserve policy. And the reserve of final resting place is our capital reserve. So we have a number of reserves where we establish legal levels that are set aside under the reserve policy. Once those amounts are set at their appropriate levels, then any remaining amounts flow into the capital reserve. So what staff is saying as of the June 30, 2019 report is that there is $4 million in the reserve for capital improvements that's beyond what we've programmed out over the next 5 years on the capital improvement plan. So what that means is staff, council could, if they chose, find $4 million of new initiatives that they could fund with those dollars. Or they could say, you know, we would like as a priority $2 million of that $4 million to go into the reserve for pension or OPEB or pension obligations, as an example. So it is a combination of, once we've set all of our reserves at their required levels, if there's any excess amounts available from reserves the prior year that now don't need to be at that high level, that flows into the capital reserve. If there's money available from the surplus during the year that hasn't been used to set levels, that also flows into the reserve. So it's a combination of many factors that arrive, but we can tell you that the $4 million is a very solid number. It's the audited number, and it is truly available, has not been programmed.
Ms. Pavetti, you want to comment?
I do. Let me try a different approach in terms of explaining it.
And look at the CIP number. I think that's changed too.
Okay, so
I recall we were looking at a CIP number of 19 million a couple years ago for a 5-year forecast, and I'm seeing 13 now. So that might be part of it. And the problem I'm having is I watch fairly carefully what we're not allocating, and $4 million is a lot to slip past me. I can't see where $4 million slipped past me that is all of a sudden available. That's where I'm having trouble. I understand all the flow through and how it can get there, but I'm trying to watch those things as we do different budget stuffs. And in my mind, $4 million is a lot to just pop out.
okay, so if I'm going to address this in two different ways. So one way is, in years past, we've had $2 million of surplus, $4 million of surplus, and the council in its wisdom has given us guidance, put some of it towards pensions, put some of it towards capital. The capital budget and the capital budget that you approved for the current fiscal year is one of our biggest capital budgets that we've had in a long, long time. And tonight, we adopted and are moving forward with our annual street project, and that could not be made possible without the capital budget that we have. So no money has slipped through. We have a budget, we have a capital budget, and we are moving forward with implementing those adopted documents. So those budgets are set. Then we do the audit. So we learned in December December 17th, and the resolution that you passed, that there is an assigned capital special projects reserve in the amount of $13.2 million. And that's the same number that's in the chart on page 16 of 17. So that's in the resolution. In addition, the resolution identifies all of the assignments per our general fund policy of how we have to put money aside for catastrophic, for
Hang on
our-
a second, Ms. Pavetti. Mr. Andrews, do you have that document you can put up?
I'm going to put that one up, and then I believe the town manager is then going to segue into the previous allocated areas of the 13 million, which I believe.
I am, that's correct. So,
What Ms. Pavetti is holding up is not what's on the screen. What I'm
Right.
trying to figure out is what Ms. Pavetti is holding up.
I'm holding up the resolution that you adopted in December, that what Arn Andrews is putting up on the Elmo is more of a reader-friendly description of those assignments of the dollars based on our reserve policy and based on the audited figures. All those numbers are exactly the same, and they add up to the total fund balance of $37.9. So that's all in there, and it's all accounted for. And so it talks about what's been assigned, and within that, again, you'll see the line item of capital special projects, which is the $13.26 million.
Okay, Council, that's page 15 of 17.
Right, so 15 of 17, and again, you know, in all fairness, there's some discretion if council says, you know, if you want to reassign some of the things that are assigned in some of those assignment areas, you also have the discretion to do that. And then what we've done, and you know, quite frankly, staff didn't have to be this conservative. We said, you know, the 1920 budget, we've already, of that 13.2, we've taken 5.8 of it, and it's already programmed, because we didn't anticipate quite the healthy year that we did have. And then we're assuming a bare minimum of $500,000 per year. We could jump that up to $1 million a year, you know, but we thought, you know, council, again, may wish to have the discretion rather than putting it all into capital to put it towards other priorities. So what we've done is try to link your resolution that you adopted in December with now the clarity of, after having made all these assignments, because we have a holding reserve called Capital Special Projects, of that, $4 million has not been identified for a particular project. 5.8 of it has been identified for particular projects. $500,000 per year out in the out years of the 5-year, that has been programmed, so at a bare minimum, we need to keep that. But in all fairness, we're saying, while we're happy to program it for you, don't get me wrong, we're happy to do it, we thought, okay, there's actually $4 million here, and council could say, let's keep $3 million of it in capital, let's pull $1 million out and throw it into OPEB pension, or whatever your other priorities are. So all of this has been already disclosed, and now we're coming to you at a finer grain of detail so that you can provide us the direction tonight, and we can build you the budget that you want based on your priorities.
So if I could just try to get a summary on my question. So what I think I'm hearing is the $4 million really came from you changed what your future allocations to the CIP was from what we've had in past years. So this year you're giving us a bare minimum of $550 per year. What was it last year that you were?
It was $550 per year. That hasn't changed. It's just that we never know until the audited number comes forward how much is actually going to be placed in that capital special projects reserve. We have enough to cover our 1920 projects, which is pretty good. 5.8 million that's a good amount of money. But we also have some money left over for a new program, should the council wish to do so.
Okay.
Ms. Sayak.
So I want to make sure when I was reviewing all of this, so I want to, Director Conway, just tell me if my own assessments were correct or incorrect. I assumed that because last year, if you remember, when we looked at a reserve policy, we had closed certain reserves and condensed some. And so my assumption in the 4 million was because there were less buckets for this trickle-down reserve, there was actually more for us to look at, and that's why we had the 4 million. Is that correct? No?
There appears to be a lag here. Director Conway again. I wish it was as simple as that.
Okay.
That plays a factor, but in some of the cases where, for instance, we closed some of our internal service funds, we closed that money out of the internal service fund, we transferred it to the general fund. You would expect then that now there is $1 million maybe that could be used for whatever purpose. I believe, though, that when we closed the books, we reserved that for stores and maintenance, the maintenance. So it wasn't, it went to the general fund, but it under our reserves, if you looked at our CAFR, that $1 million wasn't freed up that we could then reallocate it for, we actually kept it for the same purpose it used to have for its internal service fund. So that's, I would agree with you that that would seem like the first place to look. The first place to look for any revenues that might be available in this $4 million comes from our year-end savings. I believe if you looked at our CAFR, we had a multi-million-dollar revenue above expense. The number's not, I don't have that at the tip of my tongue, but it was in the $4 to $5 million range. But then some of those were one-time revenues from the sale of property and things like that, which we reserved. So to make a long story short, we can come back with staff. Councilmember Rennie has asked, well, how do we have this $4 million? It's a combination of when we established, we knew our total reserve amount was $37 million. We had amounts that we had to set up as reserves for our economic uncertainty, our revenue stabilization, and all the other required reserves and all the amounts of money that we needed to fund our currently approved 5-year CIP, which has those $550,000 transfers coming out of the general fund every year. When all those amounts were set, then according to reserve policy, whatever balance is still remaining can flow into the capital reserve for capital improvements that Councilmember Rennie has pointed out. And that is also on our schedule, and that is the $4 million. We are struggling with a way to really make that easy to show because we have a number of reserves, and as the amounts change, when the required amounts change at year end, and some monies are freed up to go now to the capital reserve, it gets very difficult to explain it, but we will do our best as staff to try to come back either as part of our budget process. We can come back. It's a matter of just probably putting the puzzle back together and trying to explain Councilmember Rennie's question. I wish I could give more detail than that right now, but we can definitely do that.
But Mr. Andrews, maybe you can explain this chart, and
if I might.
I guess I'm just going to throw my 2 cents in here. What I think I'm understanding is that we budgeted for X, we ended up with Y. That difference between X and Y was the $4 million that would normally flow into our capital improvements budget, and staff said, we have it here because our audit showed that the difference was the $4 million, and now council, at your discretion, you may wish to do something other than have it flow into the capital improvements budget. Is that
That would be correct, and
close?
Councilmember Rennie's memory serves him well. Last year, this account would have started with a balance of roughly $19 million. Over the course of the year, as projects were concluded, payments were made. This year, that is starting at $13.3 million. You heard staff say that part of this has been previously allocated, and Councilmember Rennie, you're correct. You said, didn't we do additional street repair? Didn't we commit to sidewalks? And those are all these items here. When staff says council has previously allocated funds, these are the numbers we're talking about. These numbers get netted out of the $13 million. In addition, a modest $550,000 in CIP, which comes to a total amount of either previously allocated. Thank you. Which comes to a total amount of about $9.2 million, removed from the starting balance of 13.2, which is the $4 million we're discussing, and the mayor is absolutely correct. What we're saying is that either items that have already been previously allocated, we've accounted for. Staff even went ahead and removed a non-cash item. We had a discussion earlier during the CAFR about the fact that we had a non-cash item in there. So we've identified $4 million that you have never previously allocated. Per your reserve policy, that $4 million resides in this account unless you give us direction otherwise.
Okay. Do people feel comfortable going forward, Ms. Spector?
I have one question, and then whenever everybody wants to go forward, I could do that. But on page 12, I'm going to tell you what I am assuming this is, and then you can tell me what it really is. I am assuming these are the amount of payments, UAL contributions, based upon CalPERS assumed return on investment through June 30th, 2018. So one question is my assumption correct? If not, what is this depicting? And 3, are the numbers that we now know, since it's now 2019, greater or lesser?
Thank you, Council Member. So every year in the actuarial evaluations provided to the town by CalPERS, they've tried to include, similar to what staff has done with this report, some sensitivity analysis. They're trying to give participants in the plans a better appreciation for what happens if certain variables aren't met. We know that they provide, what if the discount rate were 6 instead of 7? They show what the magnitude of that change is. They also provide this table, which shows what the projected forecasted costs are, which our finance department then puts into the budget, and that's the baseline. They provide a baseline based on what the current discount rate is, which is 7%. They expect an investment return of 7%. And so you can see for 2020, 2021, and this is only the unfunded liability portion of the town's payments for miscellaneous and safety, we anticipate that unfunded liability payment to be $4.2 million in 2020, 2021, increasing to $5.8 million in 24, 25. That is built into the budget. That is the baseline scenario. But then what CalPERS does is they say, well, what if we don't earn 7%? What if we do better and we earn 12%? And then the other sensitivity they show is, well, what if we do worse and we only earn 1%? And those numbers are what you see here. And this is one of the material differences in the sensitivity analysis along with property tax. You will see that the base case versus the less investment return of 1% is a $2 million difference in 2024, 2025. And that's why when we look at the 5-year forecast, that's a base case that I believe ends at 3.1 million in the final year, suddenly turns to a negative 1.1. And I will point out that this still assumes a positive return, even though it's only 1% and they've missed 7. This is still a net positive return in the market, but this is the data they provide us, so it's the best data we have to try and show the sensitivity around what could be earnings. Another interesting thing I'll point out is in the greater investment scenario, you see 12% returns. It doesn't seem to move the unfunded liability payment much, and that's because CalPERS has a new methodology, whereas when they have gains, they're going to use those gains to buy down that discount rate. So greater returns don't necessarily help us as much as missed returns definitely create challenges.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to it seems that we have completed discuss the 5-year forecast portion. Does everyone agree? Okay. The next thing that staff is asking us to do is provide direction on other budget assumptions. And based on the staff report, just a review for Council and Ms. Pravetti or Mr. Andrews, correct me if I'm wrong, the assumptions that we're talking about are revenue assumptions based on property tax, sales tax, and transient occupancy tax forecasts, correct? Which are in our staff report.
That would be correct, and those forecasts are built in consultation with the county assessor, Muni Services, and also what our kind of trends and assessment of are the TOT transit and occupancy taxes.
And then expense assumptions, which are broken down into salary and benefits and pension benefits. Have I missed a revenue expense assumption?
No, that is the primary expense assumption. There's really nothing we can do to the pension benefit assumption. That data is provided to us by CalPERS, and they tell us what our payments need to be. Where most of the discussion seems to lie is in how we calculate salary, either for the budget, the current year, or for the forecast. The conversation illustrates that based on the methodology staff is using, there may or may not be a differential of somewhere in the $500,000 range. Once again, just directing everybody back to the table on page 11. If you did a 2% vacancy factor with an organization our size, it might equate to reduced expenses of roughly $400,000.
Okay, so my question for council is, given those categories in Mr. Andrews' summary just now, does anyone have any additional direction to provide to staff regarding those revenue and expense assumptions? Okay, seeing no one. Oh, all of a sudden everybody's got their hand up and nobody had their hand up. Ms. Sayak.
What I'd like to do, at the very least, I do want the town manager to incorporate the language that she had mentioned about just in future narratives, that assumption of where that cost savings is. And at the very least, I'd like that. I am swayed to think more of the actuals in terms of salaries, but I also understand the flexibility that Director Conway is mentioned when hiring in today's economic landscape. So I can go either way, but at the very least, I'd like a more clear narrative from the town manager on the budget assumptions.
Mr. Rennie and then Ms. Spector.
Okay, thank you. I'll just follow on with what Councilmember Sayak just said. Mr. Duryea mentioned it in his, well, it was an email and it was reread to us by Mr. Tinsley. His point was to budget closer to what you think is actually going to happen so that you manage what's going to actually happen, and then have a reserve so that if you do get that wonderful employee that, you know, you're going to go top step on that you probably wouldn't have, or you know, there was only a 60% chance you were going to go top step, but you did find that great employee, then you could pull it out of the reserve. But so I think there is some usefulness to his suggestion of it allows you to more closely manage the salaries, and, you know, as you have to hire and as you give promotions, and it makes you think about it a little bit ahead of time so that you know, forecast a little bit closer, and then we have a way of gauging, well, how did we do? Well, we went over it, but for good reason. Here's why. You know, and we had a reserve that allowed us to go over it. Right now, we can't really tell what's going on. So he has a good point in that it might, you know, I don't know how you want to, whether you change what your forecast is, or you better explain it to us or something, but I think part of the point was to better manage it. Next subject, I'd like to see the budget adequately or significantly funded for implementing the Annex 9 items. One thing that I really like the idea of that I think was mentioned for Marin, where they were getting rid of eucalyptus trees. When I drove the Forester Road area, I noticed that at the bottom where everybody had to come through just before I think it's Torney Loop and Sund, come in there, there's a stand of eucalyptus trees on the narrowest point of the road. And if there's a fire up there, those are going to be the first ones that are going to be burning hot, and everybody coming out of Forester Road has to drive past them. So in my mind, that's the first thing I would do up there, is get rid of those eucalyptus trees to make sure people can get out safely. I think there's other places in the town, so I would like us to consider a budget item that does something. I think Mr. Andrews mentioned it as grants or something that moves towards these critical items to help evacuation route kind of things.
Let me stop you for a second there and ask, is that intended to be a specific direction on a suggested use of at least a portion of the $4 million? Or is that a generalized question regarding the budget?
So that's a good point. I would leave it up to staff. I think that we're talking about a 1 or 2 year kind of thing, not a repeatable operating budget. So it could be something that's allocated out of the $4 million. I think that's probably appropriate for that.
Okay, did you have something else? I just want to make sure I'm trying to adhere to what we're being asked to do.
And if
I think that was in the...
If I may ask clarification, when you refer to the concept of a reserve, are you suggesting that if staff were to use a vacancy factor, any reduced expenses associated with that vacancy factor would then go into the reserve in case, as we move throughout the year, we do need additional funding to address any, variances in staffing?
Yeah, I would call it a salary reserve. So it allows you, at least the way I think Mr. Duryea was envisioning it, or the way I envisioned it from reading his thing, was we try to forecast and budget close to what we think is going to happen, but we leave some room for, we know there's, maybe we'll go into a recession and people won't leave as quickly, and so we will have misguessed how many open positions we're going to have, or we get that wonderful employee we have to hire. So you have some, as Mr. Conway said, we need to have some budget flexibility, and I completely agree with that. But this is a potential way to make it more transparent and to manage that portion of the budget. I think that's what I'm hearing from multiple people, finance experts from our community, is it's a management of the budget tool.
Thank you for that clarification.
Ms. Spector.
Thank you. I'll jump around all my notes here. Trying to recall everything I think we're supposed to be addressing. Starting with the $4 million, I would not automatically put that into capital improvement projects. I am not prepared right now to say where I think those funds should be allocated, except to say that pensions and wildfire are my top priorities. With regard to page 14, which was the staff's delineation of the priorities, I agree with those. It does include the pension payments and the wildfire measures. I'm not positive I would put the parking study up there with things like pensions and wildfires, but to the extent that we should move along with that because we've done so much work already, I would prioritize and focus on certain line items on that. I also agree that with Mr. Duryea, and I don't want to slaughter what he was saying because I don't say it as well or appropriately, but I think we should be budgeting to the expected, we should be going to the expected budget as opposed to a theoretical one. And I do like what Mr. Rennie was saying with regard to putting some amount aside so that if the stellar person comes in, we can get that stellar person. Thank you.
Okay, I'll get to you, Ms. Sayak. With respect to the assumptions, I'm comfortable with the revenue assumptions. The expense assumptions, I'm not particularly a fan of budgeting to the exact amount, just because as a council member, I don't want the staff or the town manager have to come back to the council and say, we have the best person on the planet for this job, but in order to hire them, we need 5 council meetings for you to budget out the $30,000 that we want to give that person, rather than just have the flexibility within our budget to be able to offer it. How we label it, I'm not particularly concerned with that as long as we are budgeting that allows us flexibility to compete in a labor market that is highly competitive to get the kind of staff that we want to have to provide services that we're used to in the town. I think to me, it comes down to a matter of labeling, and I'm not particularly concerned with the labeling. On the 4 million, to me, that's just something that we haven't said where we want to put it yet. It's not something that's appeared that we've rubbed a genie bottle or something. We just haven't decided where we want to say we want to use it. And it normally goes into the capital improvements projects, which I think is fine because to me, and I've said this a number of times, capital improvements and capital maintenance of our streets and infrastructure is just as much a continuing debt as is our pension obligations. We will always have to be doing that. And to the extent that we ignore it, we will owe more, just like our pension obligations. So I'm not particularly enthusiastic about, if you will, robbing it, unquote, quote unquote. However, if I was going to redirect any of that $4 million, I would use a portion of it for the grants kind of programs that Mr. Andrews was talking about with fires. I think that would be a great use of it. I would very much like to allocate some of it to not continuing parking studies, but implementation of the measures that we have been given on the parking studies. For example, employee parking, perhaps subsidizing employee permit or a shuttle that not just for downtown parties, but to get employees to their work so that we can implement some of the things that were in that parking study. And part of the parking study had to do with residential and permit parking. I am not excited about reopening our residential permit parking program. However, if there are specific streets that are identified as evacuation routes that are particularly vulnerable in specific times in highly, if you will, at-risk areas, then it makes sense to consider that as a specific measure, but I would not want to reopen the discussion of I don't want the high school students to park in front of my house. I would also think about climate changes or climate action plans with respect to that 4 million, which really is to me a capital improvement or a capital expense for climate. So for example, the school bus pilot program, other infrastructure measures that we are trying to do to improve our streets for complete streets. Those are still capital improvements, but I would consider using those. The last thing that I would consider is a portion of that for pensions, which is always useful, but I would not put the entire 4 million into that. So there's my speech on budgeting. Ms. Sayak.
Very much follows along the lines of what everyone has said. The 4 priorities that we identified at our last meeting, I think if we can program it accordingly. One thing I did want to specifically highlight, during the power shutdowns, it occurred to me that do we have enough battery storage capacity in our own buildings? And so if that's something that we look at for future capital improvement, I'd like to be able to have our buildings self-sustaining in case of extended power outages.
Any other direction, Mr. Rennie?
Just very quickly, I wanted to reinforce what you said. I agree. We definitely want to fund the parking plan implementation. I like the idea of making sure we have something for climate action plan and our other infrastructures that we're considering. And then, of course, I agree with something for pensions and the wildfire, as I mentioned before.
Okay, anything else on this item? Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to 13. I'm just plowing ahead because I'm hoping we can finish it quickly. With respect to discontinuing efforts for a roundabout at Wood Road. Ms. Peterson.
Thank you, and good evening, Mayor and Council members. Lisa Peterson, Assistant Parks and Public Works Director, Town Engineer, and I'm here tonight to discuss staff's recommendation for discontinuing efforts towards a roundabout design on South Santa Cruz Avenue at Wood Road. They're getting that PowerPoint up right now. Thank you. Is it So to give you just some quick background, the town council previously approved on some summer weekends in 2016 and 17 to put in place a temporary roundabout on South Santa Cruz Avenue at Wood Road with a closure to the on-ramp to South 17. And this was to address the weekend cut-through beach traffic that the town experiences during the summer. Additionally, on January of 2017, the council approved an agreement with W-Trans, who's a consultant, a transportation consultant, to work with Caltrans on a permanent design for that roundabout at Wood Road. And this was really going to be a report that Caltrans requires to even consider it. It's called an ICE report, which is an intersection control evaluation. And then during the summer of 2018, the council ended that temporary roundabout and closure of the on-ramp. This was due to some of the business owners' concerns regarding their downtown business access being impacted by that closure, and also some unanticipated traffic impacts to the east side of Los Gatos. So the ICE report and conceptual design were given to Caltrans on November 2018. And what you see up on the screen is a drawing of that final conceptual design that was provided to Caltrans. You can see from the design that where the location where the start of the Caltrans right-of-way is. And this shows you that in order to build this design, we need to use both town right-of-way and also Caltrans right-of-way in order to make it work. So following submittal of that ICE report to Caltrans, staff had several discussions with Caltrans. And during those discussions, Caltrans was clear that in order for them to improve any type of design, roundabout design at Wood Road, they would be requiring ramp metering for that on-ramp at Wood Road. And this is a concern for engineering staff, because we do have some concerns on how that ramp metering would impact South Santa Cruz Avenue and the downtown. Ultimately, the town would not have control over that ramp metering, either when it was turned on or the intervals between the lights. So in addition to those metering requirements, Caltrans also told us that along with metering, there is also some improvements that they required, and you can see some of these improvements are shown up on the screen. So one of these improvements is an HOV lane for the on-ramp, which is going to require widening that on-ramp. An HOV lane is a carpool lane. And another improvement, one of the more expensive improvements they require, is the addition of an auxiliary lane that is to help traffic that is coming down the on-ramp to transition smoothly onto the freeway, and that would require widening Highway 17 at that location. Staff believes that those improvements would cost anywhere from $2 to $3 million, and that would be in addition to the roundabout cost, which would be anywhere from $1.3 to $1.5 million. Now, Caltrans did state that they would allow the town to submit a design exception application, and what that is a waiver application. However, there's no guarantee that they would ultimately approve that. So because of these reasons, the high cost of the ramp metering and those associated improvements, additionally, the concern from our traffic engineer regarding the impacts that would happen with to South Santa Cruz Avenue and downtown with the metering, staff is recommending to discontinue those efforts towards a roundabout design on South Santa Cruz Avenue at Wood Road. It is also important to note that during the course of these discussions, Caltrans never made any guarantee that even if we were to build that roundabout, that they would allow any type of temporary closure of that on-ramp to 17 into the future. So the memo also contains some additional recommendations that council can consider. Those are also up on the screen, and that's the end of my presentation, and I'm available to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, again, I'm going to defer council questions to Ms. Peterson. I have no cards. Does anyone want to talk to us about this? Ms. Ristow.
Hi, Maria Risto, 85 Broadway. Initially, when I saw this report, I was disappointed because I think a lot of the advantages of the roundabout, as a downtown resident I was viewing, is that South Santa Cruz is kind of a gaping maw. It's a really kind of ugly-looking street down there where it gets to the ramp. It doesn't have a lot of traffic control. It's really wide. People are coming off at freeway speeds onto a road that's 25 miles an hour. And I felt like the roundabout would help with speed mitigation in terms of people entering and exiting. It would also allow people coming off of Wood Road, making the left turn to come north on Santa Cruz Avenue, not to have to deal with cars flying on and off the freeway there. On the other hand, looking at the downside of potentially the metering lights and not knowing what that impact would be, knowing how Caltrans' decision of timing on Highway 9 at University and 9 and at Santa Cruz and 9 has really caused a lot of problems in our town. I feel like that probably is the right decision to abandon this. I do hope that, knowing that we want some traffic control and some improvement on the road there, ultimately maybe instead of a roundabout we can look at a center divide or other things that would help improve that road and create traffic calming. But with a lot of regret, I would support abandoning this also. It sounds like a very expensive prospect with little return and potentially a lot of downside. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Risto. Any questions? Thank you. Ms. Summers, I called for cards and there you were sitting there with your arms folded. But okay.
Good evening, Catherine Summers with the Chamber of Commerce. Thanks to Maria, I actually had the same feeling when I first heard that this was the staff's recommendation. I do understand the reasons why, and I do want to pose one alternative, though, and it kind of piggybacks onto what Maria was saying, that end of town really could use almost a bookmark or something to demark that, you know, it's the beginning and the end of our town. And I think that goes along with something I mentioned at the last meeting, which was maybe we should really consider hiring an urban planning consultant to come in and really look at the whole downtown. And one of the reasons I bring that up is, once again, my phone is ringing off the hook with people talking about these parklets. And while I really am enjoying watching these parklets go in, I can see why some people are concerned. And I think if we have an expert that comes in and really looks at the whole town and does a streetscape, and with, you know, with different scenarios of what it could look like, I think it will just give the public a little bit more, they'll just be at peace with it, knowing that we're not just doing all of this willy-nilly and putting this here and designing this way and deciding not to do a roundabout. And so I just think that we should be a little more thoughtful and careful in how we move into this next phase of redoing the downtown. That also then goes with the Los Gatos Boulevard. I think we could do the same thing out there.
Questions for Ms. Summers? Thank you. Mr. Stump, you're sitting there. You want to talk? Okay. I'm going to close the public portion of the hearing. We'll look to the council now for questions, comments, or a motion. Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I'd like to commend staff's effort at transparency. I see you looked and you found somebody that did a public records request and you reached out to them that this was going to be on there. I wouldn't have thought that was a place to look for people to let them know about something, but so thank you for your efforts at transparency. We're always looking for ways to let people know, and we get lots of complaint that they don't know, so thank you for those efforts. Question. In the report, you talk about we'd have minimal control over the metering light, and you know, first of all, I'd say that I'm not so scared of the metering light. If we had a metering light there and you didn't have one at Route 9, I think drivers would think more about using the Route 9 entrance and not driving through town just for the sake of getting the furthest down before they get on the highway. I think a metering light can keep the highway flowing at that portion better. If you don't have a meter light, it can clog up there. So you already get the highway moving sooner, which again, hopefully more people won't drive through our town that don't want to stop there and would use Route 9 instead. But when you say, so, you know, a critical time to use it would be beach, you know, our beach traffic issue. So minimal control means we couldn't make them do it on a Saturday when we have the most problem with that. And maybe a second part to that, I'll let you answer that question first.
Well, we do work with Caltrans, just as Maria was talking about, even with our lights on Highway 9, but it's not always the smoothest transition working with them because, of course, they're a pretty large organization, and so we may be experiencing a problem, and by the time we reach them and, you know, get them to act on something, sometimes it can take some time. So, you know, regarding the metering lights, we certainly could request and ask them to make changes. Again, it would be a matter of some negotiation, and there would be no guarantees.
And so the second thing, I don't know if maybe there's a question to it. I think certainly we don't want to pay $2 million for this, but if there's some point in the future, if they're talking about improvements to the highway where they may pay for the, you know, part of it is you need a longer lane, I guess, because you've got the HOV and everybody was talking about sort of widening of the highway there, and we don't want to be paying for that. But if there gets to a point that we can get improvements to the highway there, then we might want to consider the meter light. Then the question becomes, is there some way to do a trial or a prototype to see how badly it backs up into Los Gatos, right? You know, your concern was we would have backups that get maybe down to Main Street or something like that if we had a meter light. My thought is it will just get people to not use that entrance. But is there a way to try it out before we commit?
Oh, well, I would sort of to answer that in two ways. First of all, if it was a Caltrans project, just similar to the efficiency study that's moving forward, there would be traffic studies that would go along with that if Caltrans was actually doing that project themselves. That would give us that information. Now, one of the alternatives that we did provide in the report was we could move forward with our own traffic study since it's not a Caltrans project, and we could make a determination on what type of impact that metering light would have in the downtown area. Although ultimately, even once we figure that out, however that turns out, we would still be responsible for paying for those improvements as mentioned.
And I'm a little concerned that a traffic study might not be that accurate, you know, in this type of dynamic, that you need to try it and see what happens. Just like our one-way street, I think we found some things that we didn't expect until we actually tried it. You know, simulation can only go so far.
So again, because it's not our right-of-way, it would be, you know, Caltrans. We would, of course, need to work with them on any type of pilot, but, you know, certainly if that was something the council was interested in us looking into, we could do that.
Okay, I think that's all my comments also.
Any other questions? I have a question of whoever is appropriate. If the council took the recommended action to abandon the current Wood Road roundabout, it is not precluded from doing something else in that, at that intersection within the town right away, correct?
That's correct. And one of the alternatives that we gave was to direct staff, you know, to use the funds for some sort of alternative design in the town right-of-way for that area during the budget process. You could reprogram that money.
But we don't need to consider that right now. The only thing that staff wants us to do right now is determine whether we want to discontinue this particular roundabout design.
That's
right?
correct.
Okay. Other questions? Ms. Spector.
Thank you. And following up from that, looking at the staff report, is staff just asking us to say yay or nay on the roundabout and getting on to 17? Or are you asking us what we want to do with the remaining $355,000?
So currently, we're just asking about the roundabout and providing a recommendation. There would be an opportunity for the council during the budget process to reprogram those funds out of cut-through traffic and that roundabout design to something else that they might desire.
Great, thank you.
Other questions or discussion or a motion? Okay, I'll make a motion. My motion is that we discontinue efforts toward a roundabout design on South Santa Cruz Avenue at Wood Road.
Motion.
Seconded by Councilwoman Sayoc. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. It passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're adjourned.